Get inside now. I don't care what patch you wear. Get inside before that thing kills every one of you, Emily. Carter screamed the words into the wind, dragging a bleeding stranger by his vest toward the one door standing between 27 Hell's Angels and a tornado that was about to erase the only thing she had left. 3 years a widow, one shop, one shelter built by her husband's own hands. And in the next 10 seconds, she was about to give it to the last people in Oklahoma anyone expected her to save. Before we go any further, if this is your kind of story, hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end. And when you do drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from, I read every single one and I love seeing just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the night everything changed for Emily Carter. The wind hit the windows of the shop, first a low moan that Emily had heard before 3 years ago, the night she buried her husband under the sky that hadn't cried a single drop of rain. She hated that sound. It had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with memory. She was standing behind the register with a rag in one hand and a wrench in the other, counting the day's receipts, when the emergency radio on the shelf above the parts counter crackled to life. This is a tornado warning for Caddo County, effective immediately. Residents are advised to seek shelter now. Repeat, this is not a drill. Emily's hand froze on the counter. Not again, she whispered. Not tonight. She'd heard warnings before. Oklahoma bred them the way other states bred mosquitoes. But something in the tone of the announcer's voice, the way it cracked on the word, immediately made the hair rise on the back of her neck. She moved fast. She'd done this drill 100 times alone, but never with her heart hammering like this. She flipped the sign on the door to closed, yanked the deadbolt, and started shutting down the bay doors, one by one, the old chains groaning as she cranked them by hand because the motor had died 2 winters ago, and she'd never had the money to fix it. Come on, she muttered, wrestling the second door down. Outside, the sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise, greenish and swollen, hanging low over the flat fields that stretched out behind Carter's roadside repair. Emily had grown up under Oklahoma skies. She knew what that color meant. It meant get underground or get gone. She jogged toward the back of the shop, toward the steel hatch her husband Daniel had welded into the concrete floor 4 years earlier. Back when he still believed they'd raise kids in the apartment above the shop, back when the future still looked like something worth building toward. You always did overbuild everything, she said under her breath, kneeling to grip the hatch handle. It was something she used to tease him about. Now it was the only reason she was still alive most storm seasons. The hatch groaned open. The smell of cool earth and old wood rose up to meet her. She grabbed the flashlight she kept clipped just inside the frame and clicked it on, casting a thin beam down into the small underground shelter Daniel had built to code, and then some steel-reinforced walls, a bench bolted along one side, a shelf of canned goods that Emily restocked every spring out of habit more than hope. She was one leg over the hatch, ready to drop down and seal herself inside when she heard it. Not thunder, not wind, engines. Emily froze, one hand braced on the cold hatch frame, straining to listen over the rising howl outside. The sound grew louder, a deep rolling roar that didn't belong to any storm she'd ever lived through. It sounded almost mechanical, almost alive, cutting straight through the wind like something fighting against it instead of riding with it. What in the world? She breathed. She climbed back up out of the hatch. Against every instinct, her body was screaming at her, and moved toward the front windows of the shop. Through the grime and the rain starting to spit sideways against the glass, she saw headlights. Not one pair, not two. Dozens. They came down Route 9 like a wall motorcycle, after motorcycle riders hunched low over their handlebars, fighting a crosswind that was starting to peel loose shingles off the gas station roof across the street. Emily's stomach dropped as she watched one bike wobble violently, the rider fighting to keep it upright before straightening out again at the last second. They're not stopping, she said to no one. They're not going to make it to the next town. She knew this stretch of highway better than anyone. The next real shelter, the community storm cellar at the Baptist church, was 11 miles down the road. There was no way. Not in this wind, not with the funnel clouds she could now see forming low and ugly against the horizon, a gray finger reaching down out of a sky that had gone the color of a fresh bruise. Emily's hand found the edge of the counter and gripped it hard. This isn't your problem, a voice in her head said, cold and practical. The voice that had gotten her through 3 years of grief and unpaid bills, and a bank that called every Tuesday like clockwork. Get in your shelter, close the hatch, survive the night. But another voice, quieter, was already moving her feet toward the front door. Daniel would never forgive you. She threw the deadbolt back open with shaking hands and stepped out into wind that nearly took her off her feet. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in what felt like 10 minutes. Grit and loose gravel stung her cheeks. She raised her arm to shield her eyes and screamed as loud as she could into the storm. "Over here! Pull in here!" For a terrible second, she thought no one had heard her. The wind swallowed her voice whole. Then the lead rider's head snapped toward her, and he threw his arm out wide, signaling the others. 27 motorcycles peeled off the highway and roared into the gravel lot of Carter's roadside repair like a stampede finding the only open gate in a burning field. The lead rider skidded to a stop just feet from her boots hitting the ground to steady the bike as the wind shoved against him. He was a broad man, maybe 50 gray, beginning to streak through a dark beard, a black leather vest heavy with patches snapping against his chest. Behind him, the others were dismounting, fast, some limping, one man being half carried between two others, his arm hanging at an angle that made Emily's stomach turn. "You got shelter!" the lead rider shouted over the wind, his voice rough, urgent, none of the swagger she might have expected from a man wearing that much leather and that many patches. "Underground out back," Emily shouted. "It's small. It wasn't built for this many." "It'll have to be big enough," he said. "We got 3 men hurt bad." We were caught out in the open when this thing dropped out of nowhere. Emily's eyes swept over the group, crowding into her lot engines, still ticking as riders killed them. One by one, the sudden silence from each bike swallowed instantly by the roar of the coming storm. Some of these men looked like they'd stepped out of every warning her mother had ever given her about strangers, about bikers, about trusting the wrong people at the wrong time. Tattoos crawled up necks. Leather cuts bore patches she didn't recognize, and some she did patches that made small towns lock their doors when word got around that Hell's Angels were passing through. For one suspended heartbeat, Emily hesitated. Behind her, deep in the shop, the radio crackled again. Funnel cloud confirmed on the ground, moving northeast at approximately 40 miles per hour. Residents in the path are urged to take shelter immediately. The lead rider saw the hesitation cross her face. His jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't do any of the things Emily half expected a man like him to do when a woman stood between him and safety. "Ma'am," he said, low and steady, even as wind screamed around them both. "I know what you're seeing right now. I know what people tell you men like us are. But I got 26 brothers behind me, and 3 of them are hurt bad enough they might not walk away from this field if you shut that door on us. I'm not asking you to trust who we are. I'm asking you to let us live long enough to prove it." Something about the way he said it, not begging, not threatening, just laying the truth out flat between them, like a man with nothing left to bargain with, cracked something open in Emily's chest. She thought of Daniel. She thought of the shelter he'd built with his own hands, over-engineered, the way he over-engineered everything, because he always said the day you needed it to hold was not the day to find out it couldn't. "Get inside," she said, "now." The lead rider didn't move at first, like he hadn't quite believed she meant it. "I said now," Emily screamed, already running toward the back of the shop, toward the hatch standing open like a mouth. "It's out back. Follow me. Go, go, go." That single decision, made in less than the time it takes a heart to skip and catch itself again, was about to change both their lives forever. The scramble that followed was chaos in its purest form. 27 men, 3 of them badly injured, tried to funnel through a hatch built to comfortably hold 6. Emily stood at the top, directing traffic like a general who had never asked for this war, her voice raw from shouting over a wind that was climbing toward a scream of its own. "Watch the edge. It drops fast, you with the arm. Let them lower you. Don't try to climb. Somebody grab his legs." A younger rider, couldn't have been more than 25, stumbled past her, clutching his ribs, face gray with pain. Emily grabbed his good arm to steady him. "I got you," she said. "Almost there." "Thank you," he gasped, and then he was gone, swallowed into the dark mouth of the shelter below. The lead rider, Emily still didn't know his name, stayed at the hatch the entire time, physically lowering the worst of the injured down into waiting arms below, refusing to go down himself until every last man was accounted for. "That's 26, he said, counting under his breath, sweat and rain mixing on his face. "Where's Rookie? Where the hell is Rookie?" "Here, I'm here," a voice called from near the front of the lot, and Emily turned to see a young man couldn't have been older than 22 stumbling toward them, dragging a leg that clearly wasn't working right, blood soaking through his jeans at the thigh. The wind chose that exact moment to escalate into something that no longer sounded like weather at all. It sounded like a train, like the whole sky tearing itself apart. Emily felt the pressure change in her ears, felt her hair rip straight up and sideways at the same time. "Move!" the lead rider bellowed, and he was off the hatch and running, closing the distance to the young man in seconds, throwing the kid's arm over his shoulders and half carrying, half dragging him back toward the shelter. As debris, a piece of someone's roof, a plastic trash can, a chunk of splintered fence board cartwheeled across the lot behind them. Emily's heart stopped in her chest as she watched a 2x4 spin end over end through the air not 6 feet from where they ran. "Faster!" she screamed. "Faster! It's right behind you!" They hit the hatch at a dead sprint, and the lead rider practically threw the young man Jake. She'd learned his name was Jake. They called him Rookie down into the shelter before diving in after him. Emily was right behind them, grabbing the hatch handle with both hands. The wind tried to rip it out of her grip. For one horrifying second, she thought she wouldn't have the strength to close it, that she'd be standing exposed on the surface when whatever was coming finally arrived. She braced her boots against the concrete lip and threw her entire body weight into it. The hatch slammed shut with a metallic boom that echoed through the tiny shelter, now packed wall to wall with 27 men and Emily. Above them, the world began to end. The sound was unlike anything Emily had ever experienced, even having grown up in Tornado Alley her whole life. It wasn't a train, not really, no matter what people always said. It was more like the sky itself had opened its mouth and started screaming a deep physical roar that Emily felt in her teeth, in the marrow of her bones, in the concrete beneath her boots that seemed to hum with the violence happening just above their heads. The single bare bulb strung along the shelter ceiling flickered once, twice, and died. Someone in the darkness gasped. Someone else swore under their breath. Emily heard the distinct click of a lighter, and a small orange flame illuminated the terrified, dirt-streaked face of a man who couldn't have been older than 60, gray stubble catching the light hands shaking as he held the flame steady. "Everybody, stay calm," the lead rider's voice cut through the dark, commanding without being cruel. "We've survived worse than this. Hold on to each other. Hold on to the walls. This ain't our first storm. It's my first one underground with a house falling on top of me," someone muttered. And despite everything, despite the impossible fear pressing down on every person crammed into that concrete box, a few nervous laughs rippled through the dark. Emily found herself pressed against the back wall. Jake Rookie slumped beside her, his breathing shallow and fast. She could feel the heat radiating off his leg wound, even through his jeans, and beneath the deafening roar above them, she could hear him starting to whimper. "Hey," she said, finding his hand in the dark and gripping it. "Hey, look at me. What's your name?" Jake, he gasped. "They call me Rookie." "Okay, Jake, I'm Emily. You're going to be okay, you hear me? I need you to breathe with me." "It hurts," he groaned. "It hurts so bad." I know it does. But you're alive, and that leg is going to heal. And someday you're going to tell somebody about the night you rode out a tornado in a hole in the ground with 26 of your brothers and a stranger who probably should have had better sense than to open her door." A weak, pained laugh escaped him. "Good thing you didn't." Above them, something enormous crashed against the earth, close enough that dust and grit sifted down from the shelter ceiling into their hair, their eyes, their open mouths. A woman would have screamed. Several grown men did. "That was close," someone breathed. "That was my shop," Emily said quietly. And something in her chest went very still and very cold, even as her hands kept working, kept applying pressure to Jake's leg in the dark, kept doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was help, even while everything she owned was very possibly being torn apart 11 feet above her head. The lead rider found his way to her side in the chaos, his voice low, meant only for her. "You know that?" he asked. "Or you're guessing?" "I know the sound my roof makes when the wind gets under it wrong," Emily said. "I've heard it before, just never this bad." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm Michael. Everybody calls me Hawk." "Emily." "I know," Hawk said. "You told Jake. I was listening." Another impact shook the ground closer this time, and the entire shelter seemed to shudder around them like something alive and afraid. Emily felt Hawk's hand find her shoulder in the dark, not gripping, just present, just there. The same way he'd stayed at that hatch until every last man was accounted for. "You didn't have to do this," Hawk said quietly, barely audible under the storm. "You saw us pull up. You had every reason to bolt that door and let us figure it out ourselves. You had 3 men bleeding in a parking lot," Emily said. "There wasn't a decision to make." "There's always a decision to make," Hawk said. "Most people make the other one." Emily didn't answer that. She didn't know how to explain that somewhere in the last 10 minutes, the woman who had spent 3 years keeping her head down, keeping her guard up, trusting almost no one. Because trust was the thing that had gotten ripped out of her chest right alongside her husband. That woman had made a choice without fully deciding to make it the way your hand pulls back from a flame before your brain even registers the heat. The storm raged for what felt like hours, but was by Emily's best guess closer to 20 minutes. 20 minutes of a world coming apart above their heads, while 27 strangers and one widow sat pressed together in the dark, sharing breath, sharing fear, sharing the particular kind of silence that only exists between people who don't know if they're about to die. Somewhere in those 20 minutes, Emily heard men praying. She heard one gruff voice, low and rough, humming, something that might have been a hymn or might have just been noise to fill the terrible silence between the roars. She heard Jake's breathing even out slightly as the adrenaline in his blood finally started to answer the pressure. She kept steady on his leg. She heard Hawk's voice, low and constant, checking in with each man by name, keeping count, keeping order, keeping 26 terrified bikers from unraveling in a hole in the ground. And slowly, gradually, impossibly, the roar above them began to fade. It didn't stop all at once. It receded the way a train recedes after it's passed. The sound pulling away into the distance, the pressure in Emily's ears easing the ground beneath her, stopping its awful trembling. The wind outside dropped from a scream to a howl, to finally something that almost sounded like ordinary weather. Nobody moved for a long time. "Is it over?" someone finally whispered. "I don't know," Hawk said. "Nobody moved yet. Give it a few more minutes." They waited in silence. 28 held breaths in the dark until the only sound left was rain. Ordinary rain falling steady and unremarkable against whatever remained above them. "Okay," Hawk finally said. "Somebody get that hatch." 2 of the uninjured riders climbed the small ladder, bolted to the shelter wall, and pushed against the hatch door. It didn't budge on the first try. Emily's heart lurched. "It's stuck," one of the men called down. "Something's on top of it." "Push harder," Hawk called back. "Both of you together on 3. They counted together 1, 2, 3, and threw their combined weight against the hatch. It groaned, resisted, and finally gave way with a shriek of metal-gray daylight flooding down into the shelter for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Emily was the first one up the ladder, scrambling out into air that smelled like torn earth and splintered wood and rain, and what she saw when she straightened up and looked around stole every remaining breath from her lungs. Her shop was gone. Not damaged, not battered, gone. The bay where she'd spent 3 years keeping her husband's business alive was a scattered field of twisted metal and shattered lumber, scattered across the lot and into the field beyond, like a child's toy box had been kicked across the yard by something enormous and furious. The apartment above the shop, the one she'd shared with Daniel, the one that still held his clothes in the closet and his coffee mug in the sink exactly where he'd left it the last morning of his life, had simply ceased to exist. Behind her, one by one, the Hells Angels climbed up out of the shelter into the gray, rain-soaked morning and stopped and stared right alongside her at the devastation spread out in every direction. "Emily," Hawk said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Emily, I'm so sorry." She didn't answer right away. She couldn't. Her eyes moved slowly across the wreckage, cataloging losses the way you'd count wounds after a battle. There was the sign snapped clean off its post and driven halfway into the ground 50 feet away. There was what might have been the parts counter, now unrecognizable. There impossibly was a single wrench, her husband's favorite, lying untouched in the mud, as though the storm had spared it on purpose. Some final cruel joke from a universe that had already taken everything else. 27 of you, Emily finally said, her voice strange and distant, even to her own ears. "Made it because I had a shelter to put you in." "Yes," Hawk said, "and I don't have anywhere to put myself anymore." Nobody had an answer for that. What was there to say? 27 grown men, some of the toughest, hardest living souls in the country, stood in absolute silence in the ruin of a stranger's life. because that stranger had opened a door instead of closing one. Jake, still pale, still favoring his wounded leg, was helped up out of the shelter by two of the others and set down gently on an overturned crate that had somehow survived. He looked up at the destruction around them, and then at Emily, and his young face crumpled. "You lost everything," he said. "You lost everything saving us." "I didn't lose you," Emily said. And even in the wreckage of her own life, something in her voice held steady, held true, held on to the one thing the storm hadn't been able to take. "That's not nothing." Hawk studied her for a long moment, rain dripping steadily from the brim of the leather hat he'd somehow kept through the whole ordeal, his expression unreadable in a way that made Emily wonder exactly what kind of man stood in front of her. Wonder what 27 riders and a leader named Hawk were really capable of, whether they'd shake her hand and ride off into whatever remained of the highway, or whether this moment meant something more. "Emily," Hawk said slowly, "I need you to hear something, and I need you to understand I mean every word of it. What you did tonight, what you just did, that's not a debt 27 men can pay back with a thank you and a handshake. That's not how this works. Not for us." "I don't want anything," Emily said, and she meant it even as her voice cracked on the words, even as she looked out over the ruin of everything she'd built. "I did what anybody would have done." "No," Hawk said, and for the first time something sharp and certain entered his voice. "You didn't do what anybody would have done. Anybody would have locked that door and prayed for the best. You didn't do that. You looked at 27 strangers wearing the one patch this whole country's been taught to fear, and you let us in anyway. There's a difference between what people would do and what you did, and don't you ever let anybody, including yourself, tell you different." Emily wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the rain felt now that the adrenaline was draining out of her, now that the immediate crisis of survival had passed and left nothing behind but the wreckage of everything she owned and the uncertain weight of a stranger's gratitude. "What happens now?" she asked, more to herself than to him. Hawk looked around at the destruction, at his men. Battered and bleeding, but alive, every single one of them alive because of the woman standing in front of him. Something in his jaw tightened, something resolute and quiet settling into his expression. "Now," he said, "we make some calls." Emily didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. She was too deep in shock, too raw with loss to register the significance of the phone. Hawk pulled from an inside pocket of his vest, the way his thumb moved across the cracked screen with practiced efficiency, the low, urgent tone of his voice as he began speaking to someone on the other end. "It's Hawk," he said. Yeah, we're alive. Listen, I need you to hear something, and I need you to spread it fast." Emily turned away, drawn instead toward the wreckage of her shop, toward the place where the front counter used to stand, toward the small metal box she kept bolted beneath it that held the only photograph she still had of Daniel from their wedding day, curling at the edges, laminated against exactly this kind of disaster. Because some part of her had always known the day might come when the world tried to take everything from her at once. She dug through splintered wood and torn insulation with bare hands, ignoring the cuts, ignoring the cold searching. "Emily," Jake's voice, weak but insistent, called out behind her. "Emily, let one of us help." "I've got it," she said, not looking up, not stopping. Two of the riders knelt beside her without being asked, moving debris carefully, methodically, working alongside her in a silence that felt less like pity and more like solidarity. It took almost 10 minutes. 10 minutes of digging through the ruins of her marriage, her business, her entire adult life, before her fingers finally closed around the small metal box, dented but intact exactly where she'd left it. She pulled it free and sat back on her heels in the mud, clutching it to her chest, and for the first time since the sirens had started screaming the night before, Emily Carter allowed herself to cry. Nobody rushed her. Nobody told her it would be okay, because right then in that moment, it very clearly wasn't. The riders who had knelt beside her simply stayed a quiet, patient presence in the wreckage, giving her the space to fall apart without being alone while she did it. When she finally looked up, wiping mud and tears from her face with the back of one filthy hand, she found Hawk standing a few feet away, phone still in hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Emily," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to worry about what it means right now. I just need you to know it's happening." "What is—" "Word's already moving," Hawk said, "about what you did tonight. About 27 men who are alive because a woman who'd never met a single one of us decided we were worth saving." "It's not that big a deal," Emily said, wiping her face again, embarrassed, suddenly exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. Anybody would have. Stop saying that, Hawk cut in gentle but firm. Please, just stop saying that, because it's not true, and deep down I think you know it's not true. Emily didn't have an answer for that. She looked past him out toward the highway where 27 motorcycles sat scattered and battered across her ruined lot, and beyond that toward the flattened, storm-scarred horizon, where the sun was beginning to break weakly through gray clouds, illuminating a landscape that looked nothing like the town she'd woken up in the morning before. I don't know what I am going to do, she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them, raw and honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be in front of strangers. I don't have insurance that covers this kind of damage. I don't have savings. I don't have... Her voice broke. I don't have anything left. Hawk was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. Before he finally spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight that Emily wouldn't fully understand until much later, when the full meaning of his next words came roaring back down that highway in a way she never could have imagined. You've got 27 brothers now, he said, and brothers don't leave family standing alone in the wreckage. Emily let out a broken, disbelieving laugh, more exhaustion than humor. You barely know me. I know everything I need to know, Hawk said. I know you looked at a tornado and 27 strangers and chose to open a door instead of closing one. That tells me more about a person than 10 years of small talk ever could. Around them, the injured were being tended to as best the group could manage, with what little remained undamaged in the wreckage-torn strips of shirt fabric, doing the work of bandages. Someone's belt cinched tight above a wound to slow the bleeding. Low voices offering encouragement to men who were clearly in pain, but trying not to show it in front of their brothers. Jake sat propped against the overturned crate, his color slowly returning, watching Emily with something like awe on his young face. She dug through a collapsed building for a photograph, he said to no one in particular, and she's worried about being a big deal. A few tired, rain-soaked laughs rippled through the group, the first real lightness since the storm had hit, and Emily found herself managing a small, exhausted smile despite everything. I need to call the county, she said, forcing herself back into practical thinking, back into the version of herself that handled crises instead of feeling them. See what kind of emergency services are even coming out this way with how bad this looks. Emily, Hawk said, and something in his tone made her pause. Before you do that, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about the answer. What? This land, Hawk said, looking out over the ruined shop. The flattened outbuilding, the debris scattered across acres of what had been Carter land for 3 generations. Who else knows what happened to it? Besides us. Emily frowned, confused by the question. Nobody yet, I don't think. The whole town got hit last night from what I could hear on the radio. Before it cut out, everybody's probably dealing with their own damage right now. Hawk nodded slowly, something calculating, moving behind his eyes that Emily didn't fully understand yet, wouldn't understand for weeks, not until the full weight of what was coming finally arrived on her doorstep in a way that would change Willow Creek forever. Okay, he said. Okay, let's get everybody stable first. Let's get Jake and Marcus and Deacon looked at it properly. Then we'll figure out the rest. Emily nodded, too exhausted, too raw, too deep, in the shock of loss to push further, to ask what exactly Hawk meant by the rest, to notice the way several of the other riders exchanged glances. Behind her back, the way phones were being pulled out across the wreckage-strewn lot. Low voices already spreading word to chapters Emily Carter had never heard of and couldn't possibly have imagined were about to hear her name. She busied herself instead with what she knew how to do, tending wounds, finding what supplies had survived in the twisted wreckage of her shop, keeping her hands moving so her mind wouldn't have to sit still long enough to fully absorb everything she'd lost in the last 12 hours. She checked on Jake's leg, found an old first aid kit miraculously intact beneath a collapsed shelf, and set to work properly cleaning and dressing the wound, while Hawk supervised from a few feet away, his phone pressed to his ear again, his voice low and urgent. 27 of us, yeah. We'd have died out there if she hadn't opened that door. No, I'm serious, preacher. I need this to move fast. Yeah, tell them all. Every chapter that can hear you. Emily didn't catch all of it, focused as she was on threading a proper bandage around Jake's thigh, on ignoring the way her hands had started to shake now that the immediate danger had passed, and the full weight of everything ahead of her was beginning to settle into her bones. You're good at this, Jake said quietly, watching her work. My husband used to say I should have been a nurse instead of a mechanic's wife, Emily said, and then went still surprised at herself at how easily Daniel's memory had slipped out into conversation with a stranger, something she rarely allowed herself to do. Used to be, Jake asked gently. He passed 3 years ago. Emily tied off the bandage with practiced efficiency, not looking up. Heart attack, 41 years old, fixed cars his whole life, and it was his own heart that finally gave out. I'm sorry, Jake said. Everybody is, Emily said, and there was no bitterness in it, just a tired kind of truth. Doesn't change much. Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her. This shop, it was his father's before that. 3 generations of Carters kept this land running. Emily finally looked up out over the ruined lot, the twisted metal, the scattered lumber that used to be walls and a roof and a life. Guess that's over now. Don't say that, Jake said, surprising her with the sudden intensity in his young voice. Don't you dare say that. Emily looked at him startled. You don't know Hawk, Jake said. You don't know what he's like when somebody does right by one of us. This isn't over, Emily. This isn't even close to over. Before Emily could ask him what exactly he meant, Hawk's voice cut across the lot, calling for everyone's attention. His phone finally lowered his expression, carrying a gravity that silenced the scattered conversations across the wreckage immediately. Listen up, Hawk said, and every rider injured or not turned toward him. I know we're all running on fumes right now. I know everybody's hurting. Everybody's exhausted. Everybody wants to go home and sleep for a week. But before we do anything else, I need every man here to understand something. He paused, his eyes finding Emily across the ruined lot, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. This woman put her life on the line for every single one of us last night. She had a warm, safe hole in the ground built for her and her alone, and instead of locking herself inside it, she stood out in a tornado and dragged 27 strangers to safety. She lost her home doing it. She lost her business doing it. She may have lost everything her family ever built doing it. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the steady drip of rainwater off shattered lumber, off leather vests, off bowed heads. We don't leave that unanswered. Hawk said, his voice hard now, certain carrying the weight of a man who had made a decision and would not be talked out of it. Not today, not ever. Every man here is going to remember this night, and every man here is going to make sure the whole club remembers it too. Because what happened here, what Emily Carter did here, that's the kind of thing that reminds people why the patch is supposed to mean something. A low murmur of agreement rolled through the group. Rough voices, tired voices, but united, unshakable. Emily stood frozen at the edge of the wreckage, Jake's bandaged leg forgotten for a moment, watching 27 battered strangers nod in solemn agreement with a man she'd known for less than 12 hours, feeling something she couldn't quite name settle into her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that hadn't visited her in the 3 long years since she'd buried her husband and started learning how to survive entirely alone. She didn't know yet what Hawk's promise would come to mean. She didn't know that phones were already ringing in cities she'd never visited, that a name hers was already being spoken in clubhouses and garages and roadside bars from Oklahoma to Texas to places even further out, carried by men who understood a debt when they saw one and had no intention of leaving it unpaid. She didn't know that the empty highway stretching out past her ruined shop would in the weeks to come fill with more motorcycles than this small town had ever seen in its entire history. All Emily Carter knew, standing in the wreckage of everything she'd built, rain finally beginning to slow to a drizzle around her, was that for the first time in 3 years she wasn't standing completely alone. And somewhere out on that highway, engines were already starting to turn toward Willow Creek, Oklahoma, carrying word of a debt 27 men intended to repay in full. The rain had thinned to a fine mist by the time the first siren cut through the wreckage of Willow Creek, but Emily barely registered the sound over the ringing still trapped in her ears from 20 minutes underground. She turned to see red and blue lights strobing weakly through the gray morning, an ambulance and a single sheriff's cruiser bouncing over debris that used to be a road. Finally, Hawk muttered, already moving toward the vehicles, waving his arms overhead. Over here. We got 3 injured, 1 bad. The paramedics moved fast, but Emily noticed the way the sheriff hung back near his cruiser, one hand resting on his belt, eyes scanning the crowd of leather and tattoos gathered across her ruined lot, like he was doing math he didn't like the answer to. Ma'am, the sheriff called to her, voice carrying a wary edge. You all right, these men bothering you? Emily wiped mud from her face with the back of her hand, straightened her spine, and looked the man dead in the eye. "These men are alive because I let them into my shelter, Sheriff Whitfield," she said. "And I'm alive because they carried me through a door I couldn't have gotten to on my own. Nobody's bothering anybody. We survived a tornado together. That's all that happened here." Whitfield's eyes moved slowly across the group, lingering on the patches, the vests, the tattoos, and Emily could see the old assumptions working behind his expression, the same assumptions she'd fought down herself less than an hour earlier. "That true?" he asked Hawk directly. Every word Hawk said, not backing down, not raising his voice either. "You can check with the county. We were caught out on 9 when the funnel touched down. This woman opened her shelter to 27 strangers when she had every reason not to. You want to arrest somebody? Sheriff arrests the storm." Whitfield held Hawk's gaze a long moment, then exhaled and looked away toward the paramedics working over Jake's leg. "Get that boy to Caddo General. I want to look at the rest of you before you go anywhere. Storm knocked half this county flat. I don't need trouble on top of it." "There isn't going to be any trouble," Emily said. "I give you my word." Something in the way she said it, flat, certain, unwilling to be argued with, made the sheriff's shoulders drop half an inch. He nodded once short and clipped and moved off toward his cruiser to radio in the damage. Jake was loaded onto a stretcher, pale and sweating, his hand finding Emily's wrist as they lifted him. "Hey," he rasped. "Hey, you're going to be here when I get back, right?" "Where else would I be?" Emily said, forcing a smile she didn't fully feel. "Somebody's got to keep an eye on this mess." "Promise me," Jake said, more urgent than the moment called for, his young face suddenly tight with something that looked like fear that had nothing to do with his leg. "I promise," Emily said, and meant it, though she had no idea yet what that promise would cost her. The paramedics wheeled him toward the ambulance, Hawk walking alongside the stretcher. The entire way, leaning down to say something low that made Jake nod, made his grip on the rail ease slightly. 2 more riders, the ones Hawk had called Marcus and Deacon, were loaded in behind him. One with a dislocated shoulder, strapped tight against his chest, the other favoring ribs that had turned an ugly shade of purple beneath a torn shirt. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The siren rose, and within seconds it was gone down the shattered remains of Route 9, carrying 3 of Emily's 27 strangers toward a hospital that was probably already overwhelmed with half the county's storm wounded. That left 24 Hells Angels standing in the mud and wreckage of Carter's roadside repair, and one woman who had lost everything she owned in the span of a single night. "Okay," Hawk said, turning back to face the group, rain dripping off the brim of his hat. "Listen up. We're not leaving her like this." A murmur of agreement rolled through the men, but Emily shook her head, already stepping forward. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You've got your own lives, your own families waiting to hear if you made it. I'll manage." "Emily." Hawk's voice was gentle but immovable, the same tone he'd used at the hatch the night before when he'd told her they weren't leaving without every last man accounted for. "You dragged 27 strangers out of a tornado. The least we can do is help you find your kitchen sink." A few tired laughs broke the tension, and despite everything, despite the grief sitting like a stone in her chest, Emily felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. "Fine," she said, "but somebody's got to call the utility company about that downed line by the road before one of you idiots gets electrocuted playing hero twice in one day." "Yes, ma'am," one of the older riders said, already peeling off toward his bike to make the call. And just like that, without any further debate, 24 men who owed her everything got to work clearing the wreckage of a life they'd only known for 12 hours. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, dragging splintered lumber into piles, salvaging what tools and parts could be recovered from the crushed remains of the shop, tarping over the exposed section of the apartment that hadn't collapsed entirely. Emily found herself directing men twice her size like she'd been doing it her whole life. And more than once, she caught herself almost laughing at the sight of leather-clad bikers hauling debris shoulder to shoulder like the world's most unlikely construction crew. "You know," said an older rider with a gray beard and a patch that read SGGT at arms, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "In 30 years riding with this club, I've seen a lot of things. Never seen Hawk order an entire chapter to spend their afternoon shoveling mud for a stranger." "I'm not really a stranger anymore, am I?" Emily said, hauling a bent piece of sheet metal toward the growing scrap pile. The old rider studied her for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his weathered face. "No, ma'am. Reckon you're not." By the time the light started fading, the worst of the immediate debris had been cleared, exposing just how thorough the destruction really was. The shop's foundation stood bare and scarred. The apartment above was a skeleton of exposed beams. Emily stood in the middle of it all, hands raw and blistered, and felt the exhaustion finally catch up to the adrenaline that had carried her through the last 20 hours. Hawk found her there, staring at nothing, and settled beside her without a word for a long moment. "We can't stay forever," he finally said. "Some of the men have families 3 states over who don't know yet if they're alive. I've got to get them home, get the injured ones properly looked after." "But Emily," he turned to face her fully. "This isn't goodbye. You understand that." "You said that already," Emily said quietly, back before the ambulance came. "I meant it then. Mean it more now." Hawk reached into his vest and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, pressing it into her hand. "That's a number. Not mine, a landline at a clubhouse 200 miles from here, one that's manned around the clock. Anything happens, anything at all, insurance trouble, somebody trying to take advantage while you're down, anything, you call that number and you say my name. You understand me?" Emily looked down at the number, the ink already starting to blur slightly from the damp, and felt something tighten in her throat. "I don't need charity," she said. "This isn't charity," Hawk said, and his voice carried a weight that silenced any further argument. "This is a debt, and debts like this we don't forget. Not this club, not ever." Emily folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her jacket, one of the only pieces of clothing she had left that wasn't soaked through with mud and rain. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt entirely too small for what they were meant to carry. By nightfall, the motorcycles rolled out one by one down the battered stretch of Route 9, engines echoing across a landscape that looked more like a war zone than a farming town. Emily stood alone in the ruins of her family's business and watched the taillights fade into the dark, and for the first time since the sirens had started screaming the night before, the silence around her felt enormous, hollow, absolute. She didn't cry again. She'd already emptied herself out once that day, kneeling in the mud with Daniel's photograph clutched to her chest. Instead, she climbed down into the shelter that had saved 27 lives, pulled the hatch shut behind her, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had simply run out of anything left to fight with. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of insurance calls, county assessments, and the particular exhaustion of trying to rebuild a life from nothing. Willow Creek, it turned out, had been hit hard across 3 separate neighborhoods, and Emily quickly discovered that being one of dozens of families filing storm claims meant waiting in lines, waiting on hold, waiting for adjusters who were stretched thin across a county full of disaster. It was nearly 2 weeks before Roger Pruitt, the adjuster assigned to her claim, finally pulled his sedan into what remained of her gravel lot. He was a thin, sharp-featured man in a rain jacket that looked too clean for someone supposedly touring storm damage all day, and he barely glanced at Emily before pulling out a tablet and beginning to circle the wreckage with the brisk efficiency of a man checking boxes rather than assessing a life. "Mrs. Carter," he said, not looking up from his screen, "I've reviewed the initial photos your neighbor submitted along with your claim. I have to be upfront with you, this doesn't look promising." "What do you mean, not promising?" Emily asked, following him across the lot. "The whole building is gone. The apartment, the shop, everything. Your policy covers wind damage up to a certain threshold," Pruitt said, still not making eye contact. "But there's a structural pre-existing condition clause here that's going to complicate things significantly. Your file shows the roof was flagged for wear during your last renewal inspection 3 years ago." Emily felt the ground shift beneath her. That inspection was routine. Every shop that age gets flagged for something. "Be that as it may," Pruitt said, tapping something into his tablet, "the company's position is likely going to be that the pre-existing wear contributed materially to the extent of the collapse. That puts us in a gray area regarding full replacement value." "A gray area," Emily repeated, her voice flat with disbelief. "My husband built that shop with his own hands. It survived 20 years of storms before this one. Are you telling me because of a routine flag on a form I might not get covered at all?" "I'm telling you it's complicated," Pruitt said, finally looking up, and something in his expression, too smooth, too rehearsed, made the hair on the back of Emily's neck rise the same way it had the night the sirens first went off. "I'll have a formal determination for you within 30 days. 30 days, Emily said. "Mr. Pruitt, I don't have 30 days. I don't have a roof over my head. I've been sleeping in a shelter meant for emergencies, not for living." I understand this is difficult, Pruitt said in a tone that suggested he understood nothing at all, but I have to follow the process. In the meantime, I'd recommend looking into your other options. What other options? Pruitt hesitated just for a second, just long enough that Emily caught it. There are parties in the area interested in storm-damaged properties, he said carefully. Sometimes a clean sale is less complicated than a lengthy rebuild, especially for a property this size given the current market. Something cold settled in Emily's stomach. Are you seriously standing in the wreckage of my family's business, telling me to sell it before you've even finished deciding whether you're going to cover the damage? I'm simply saying it's an option worth considering, Pruitt said, already retreating toward his car tablet clutched against his chest like a shield. I'll be in touch, Mrs. Carter. He drove off before Emily could say another word, leaving her standing alone in the mud staring after him, with a slow, dawning unease she couldn't quite name yet. But that would come to define the next several weeks of her life in ways she never could have predicted. The bank called the following Tuesday. Mrs. Carter, this is regarding your outstanding balance on the commercial property loan, said a voice that sounded as tired of making these calls as Emily was of receiving them. We understand you've experienced significant property damage, and we want to work with you, but I have to inform you the grace period on missed payments is limited. If we don't receive some indication of resolution within 60 days, the bank will be forced to begin foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure, Emily repeated, gripping the phone so hard her knuckles went white. On a building that doesn't exist anymore. On the land, Mrs. Carter. The loan is secured against the property itself. Emily hung up without saying goodbye, sat down hard on the edge of the shelter's ladder, and pressed both hands against her face, breathing slow and deliberate, refusing to let the panic climbing up her throat win. Daniel would know what to do, she thought, and then hated herself for the thought because Daniel wasn't here, hadn't been here for 3 years, and the entire weight of keeping his family's legacy alive had rested on her shoulders alone since the day they'd lowered him into the ground. She thought about the folded scrap of paper in her jacket pocket. She'd looked at it a dozen times over the past 2 weeks, turned it over in her fingers, told herself she wasn't desperate enough yet to use it. That calling a stranger's clubhouse over a bank problem felt like exactly the kind of overreaction that would make Hawk regret ever handing it to her. She didn't call. Not yet. Instead, she went back to work, salvaging what tools she could, taking on small repair jobs out of the open-air remains of her bay, using a borrowed generator to run just enough power for basic diagnostics, determined to prove to the bank, to the insurance company, to herself, that Carter's roadside repair wasn't finished yet. It was 3 days later that the black sedan first appeared. Emily was elbow-deep in a customer's carburetor when the car pulled into the lot, sleek and out of place against the scarred landscape around it, and a man in an expensive coat stepped out with the easy confidence of someone who had never once worried about where his next meal was coming from. Mrs. Carter, Isham, he said, extending a hand she didn't take. Gordon Crane, I represent Crane Land Holdings. I understand you've had quite the ordeal. I've had a tornado, Emily said, wiping grease from her hands with a rag instead of shaking his. What can I do for you, Mr. Crane? Straight to business, I like that. Crane smiled, a practiced, gleaming thing that didn't reach his eyes. My company's been acquiring storm-affected properties across the county, helping folks who are underwater on rebuilding costs get a fair price and a clean exit. I understand your claim's been complicated. I'd like to make you an offer that solves that problem entirely. He named a figure. It was, Emily knew instantly, less than half of what the land alone was worth, to say nothing of 3 generations of Carter history built into every inch of it. That's insulting, Emily said flatly. I understand it might feel that way, Crane said, unbothered, still smiling. But given your current situation, the loan, the disputed insurance claim, the cost of rebuilding from scratch, I'd encourage you to think practically rather than emotionally. These things have a way of getting harder before they get easier, Mrs. Carter. Something about the specific way he said it, the disputed insurance claim, snagged in Emily's mind like a hook catching on fabric. How do you know about my insurance claim? She asked slowly. That's not public information. For the briefest flicker, something shifted behind Crane's polished expression, there and gone so fast Emily almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Small county, he said smoothly. Word travels. Word travels, Emily repeated, watching him carefully now. The mechanic in her running diagnostics on a different kind of engine, entirely listening for the telltale knock of something not quite right. Mr. Crane, I think you should leave now. Of course, Crane said, unbothered, already retreating toward his car. The offer stands for 30 days. I'd think carefully, Mrs. Carter. Rebuilding this place from nothing alone, with a foreclosure clock ticking, that's a very long road for one person to walk by herself. He drove off and Emily stood in the settling dust of his departure, with her heart hammering, turning his words over and over, the phrase, the disputed insurance claim, echoing louder each time. That night, unable to sleep in the cramped confines of the shelter, Emily dug out the folder of paperwork Pruitt had left with her copies of the claim assessment, the pre-existing condition flag. The initial denial letter that had arrived that same afternoon, cold and bureaucratic, citing exactly the roof inspection issue Pruitt had warned her about weeks earlier. She read it 3 times before something caught her eye, a small notation at the bottom of the letter, a case reference number that matched a filing prefix she didn't recognize. On a hunch, working by flashlight with her laptop balanced on her knees, its battery running dangerously low, Emily searched the prefix. What she found made her blood run cold. The prefix belonged to a private adjustment firm, a subcontractor the insurance company used for complicated claims, a firm that, according to a county business registry she dug up after 20 minutes of increasingly frantic searching, was partially owned by a holding company whose registered agent's address matched almost exactly the address listed for Crane Land Holdings. Roger Pruitt didn't just work for the insurance company. He was in some tangled corporate way. Emily didn't fully understand yet, connected to the very man trying to buy her land out from under her for pennies on the dollar. "Oh my God," Emily whispered into the dark of the shelter, her hands trembling as she stared at the screen. This wasn't an accident. This was never an accident. She sat there a long time, the flashlight beam trembling slightly, with the shake in her hands, piecing it together with the slow, sick clarity of someone finally seeing a trap they'd already half-stepped into. The pre-existing condition flag. The convenient 30-day determination window that lined up perfectly with Crane's own 30-day offer deadline. The foreclosure timeline the bank had cited, which she checked, heart-pounding, and matched almost exactly the timeline Crane had referenced in his own visit, as though he already knew precisely how long she had before the walls closed in completely. They weren't circling a storm victim. They were executing a plan. Emily didn't sleep at all that night. She sat in the shelter with her back against the cold concrete wall, staring at the folded scrap of paper Hawk had given her, turning it over and over in her fingers as the first gray light of dawn began creeping down through the open hatch above her. Anything happens, anything at all, you call that number. But what could 27 bikers from 3 states away actually do about a corrupt insurance adjuster and a predatory developer with paperwork and lawyers on their side? This wasn't a tornado. This wasn't something you could carry a person through. This was slow, bureaucratic, suffocating, the kind of fight that ground people down, not through violence, but through exhaustion, through 30-day windows and denied claims and phone calls that went unanswered until you finally wearily signed whatever was put in front of you just to make it stop. She thought about calling the number right then. Her fingers actually found her phone, pulled up the keypad, hovered over the digits. Then she stopped. They already gave you enough, she told herself. They pulled you into a night you can't ever repay. You don't get to call in more favors over a fight that might not even be winnable. She put the phone down and told herself she'd handle it alone the way she'd handled everything alone for 3 years. It was a decision she would come to regret, though not for the reasons she expected. Over the following 2 weeks, Emily threw herself into building a case. She drove 40 minutes to the county courthouse and pulled every public record she could find on Crane Land Holdings, discovering a pattern that made her stomach turn. 3 other storm-damaged properties across the county, all purchased within weeks of denied or delayed insurance claims, all processed through the same adjustment subcontractor, all sold at a fraction of assessed value to families who, according to hushed conversations Emily had with 2 of the other sellers over the phone, had felt exactly the same slow, suffocating pressure she was feeling now. "We didn't have a choice," one elderly woman told, her voice thin and defeated over a bad phone connection. "The bank was going to take it anyway. At least this way we got something." "Did you know the adjuster and the buyer were connected?" Emily asked. A long pause. "No, nobody told us that. Would it have mattered? We still would have lost the fight either way. Folks like us don't win against folks like that." Emily hung up the call with her jaw clenched so tight it ached, a fury building in her chest that was different from grief, sharper, more useful. She wasn't going to be another name on Gordon Crane's quiet list of quietly broken families. But knowing you were being cheated and proving it in a way that mattered were two very different things. And as the days ticked down toward both the insurance company's final determination and Crane's 30-day offer window, Emily found herself running out of time faster than she was running out of resolve. The bank sent a formal notice. 30 days remaining before foreclosure proceedings would officially begin. The insurance company sent its final determination 2 days later, claims substantially denied, citing the pre-existing structural condition, offering a settlement so small it wouldn't cover a quarter of the cost to clear the remaining debris, let alone rebuild. And that same afternoon, Gordon Crane's black sedan rolled back into the lot right on schedule, like a predator that had been patiently watching the clock the entire time. "Mrs. Carter," he said, stepping out with the same easy, gleaming smile, "I hope you've had time to think things over." "I know what you did," Emily said, standing her ground in the middle of the wreckage that used to be her livelihood, arms crossed, voice steady, despite the exhaustion carved into every line of her face. "I know about Pruitt. I know about the other families. I know exactly how this works, Mr. Crane." For a moment, something flickered across Crane's face. Not guilt, Emily realized with a cold clarity, but mild condescending amusement, the expression of a man who had heard this particular accusation before and had never once lost any sleep over it. "That's a very creative theory, Mrs. Carter," he said. "I'd be careful throwing around accusations like that without proof. Slander is expensive, and from where I'm standing, offensive isn't exactly your strong suit right now." "I have records," Emily said, though even as she said it, she heard how thin it sounded, how a stack of public filings and a hunch about matching addresses probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes against a team of corporate lawyers. "I'm sure you do," Crane said, unbothered, reaching into his coat and producing a thick manila envelope which he held out toward her with the casual cruelty of a man offering a drowning woman a single, barely adequate life preserver. "This is my final offer. It expires at 5 o'clock tomorrow. After that, I withdraw it entirely. The bank forecloses and you walk away with nothing at all instead of something. I'd think very carefully about which outcome serves you better, Mrs. Carter." Emily didn't take the envelope. She stood perfectly still, staring at him, feeling something in her chest crack under the sheer grinding weight of it all. The storm, the grief, the insurance company, the bank, and now this man standing in the ruins of her husband's legacy with a smile like a closing trap. "Get off my property," she said quietly. "It's barely your property anymore," Crane said, but he set the envelope down on the hood of her truck. Anyway, unbothered, already turning back toward his car. 5 o'clock tomorrow, Mrs. Carter. Think hard." He drove off, gravel crunching under expensive tires, and Emily stood alone in the settling dust, staring down at the envelope sitting on her truck, like an accusation, like a countdown, like the final page of a story she'd never agreed to be written into. She didn't sleep that night either. She sat in the shelter, the envelope unopened on the bench beside her, and finally, for the first time since Hawk had pressed that scrap of paper into her hand, she pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed the number. It rang 4 times. 5. Emily's heart sank with each unanswered ring, the old fear creeping back in that the promise had been nothing more than the adrenaline of a shared survival, that men who rode off into the night didn't actually mean it when they said this isn't goodbye. On the 6th ring, a rough voice answered. "Yeah. Hi. I'm sorry to call so late." Emily started, her voice cracking, despite every effort to keep it steady. "My name is Emily Carter, Michael Reynolds Hawk. He gave me this number. He told me to call if." "Emily Carter," the voice on the other end repeated, and something in the tone shifted. Immediately sharpened, came fully alert. "The Emily Carter from Willow Creek." "Yeah," Emily said, startled. "You know who I am." "Ma'am, every chapter east of the Mississippi knows who you are," the voice said. Hold on, right there, don't hang up." Emily heard muffled voices in the background, urgent overlapping, someone shouting a name she didn't catch. The scrape of a chair, footsteps, and then a familiar voice, rough with sleep, but instantly fully awake, the moment he understood who was on the line. "Emily." "Hawk," Emily said, and felt something in her chest finally give way, 3 weeks of held-together composure cracking it all at once. "Hawk, I'm sorry. I know it's late. I know you've probably got your own life to get back to. I didn't know who else to call." "Emily, slow down," Hawk said, his voice steady, grounding, cutting through the panic rising in her throat. "Tell me what's happening. Right now, everything." And so sitting alone in the shelter that had saved 27 lives with a countdown ticking toward 5 o'clock the next afternoon and an envelope full of a stranger's cruelty sitting on the bench beside her, Emily Carter told Michael, Hawk, Reynolds, everything: the adjuster, the pre-existing condition flag, the matching addresses, the pattern of families quietly broken and bought out across the county, the bank's foreclosure clock. Crane's smile. The offer expiring in less than 18 hours. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when she finished long enough that Emily wondered if the call had dropped. Hawk, are you still there? I'm here, Hawk said, and his voice had changed entirely, gone flat and cold, and absolutely certain in a way that made the hair rise on Emily's arms. Emily, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Okay. Don't sign anything. Don't take that meeting tomorrow. Don't do anything but sit tight and wait. Wait for what? Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. There was another pause, and when Hawk spoke again, there was something in his voice that Emily hadn't heard from him even in the middle of the tornado, even with 3 men bleeding and a funnel cloud bearing down. Something that sounded almost like relief, like a man who had finally, after weeks of waiting, been handed exactly the fight he'd been hoping for. You saved 27 of my brothers, Hawk said. You think this club forgets a debt like that over some paperwork and a crooked insurance man? Emily, I need you to trust me on this one more time, the same way you trusted us with that shelter door. Don't sign, don't sell, don't give that man 1 single inch tomorrow. Hawk, I don't understand what you think you can do. You don't need to understand it yet, Hawk said. You just need to hold that line for 1 more day. Can you do that? Emily looked at the envelope sitting on the bench, at the shadow of everything she stood to lose. If she guessed wrong, if she trusted a promise made by strangers over the cold, immediate certainty of a check that could at least stop the bleeding. Yes, she said finally, her voice small but steady. Yes, I can do that. Good, Hawk said. Now get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. The line went dead before Emily could ask him what he meant, before she could ask what exactly a man 300 miles away thought he could do about a corporation, a corrupt adjuster, and a bank foreclosure clock that didn't care about promises made in the wreckage of a tornado. She sat in the dark for a long time afterward, phone still clutched in her hands, staring up through the open hatch at a sky finally clear of storm clouds scattered with more stars than she'd seen in years. Somewhere out there, engines she couldn't yet hear were already starting to turn. Morning came slow and gray over Willow Creek, the kind of pale Oklahoma dawn that made everything look like it was still deciding whether to be a good day or a bad one. Emily hadn't really slept. She drifted in and out on the shelter bench phone, clutched against her chest like a lifeline, replaying Hawk's voice over and over in her head until the words stopped sounding like a promise and started sounding like something she might have imagined out of pure desperation. Don't sign, don't sell, don't give that man 1 single inch. She climbed out of the shelter a little after 6 joints, stiff eyes burning, and found the envelope exactly where she'd left it, sitting on the bench like a coiled snake pretending to be paperwork. She didn't touch it. She made herself a cup of instant coffee on the little camp stove she'd been using for 2 weeks, wrapped her hands around the tin cup for warmth, and watched the sun try to burn through the low clouds over the flattened tree line. By 7, her phone buzzed, not Hawk, a number she didn't recognize, local area code. Mrs. Carter, this is Denise from the Caddo County Gazette. I'm doing a follow-up piece on storm recovery efforts, and I understand you had quite the experience of the night of the tornado. Something about a large group of motorcyclists. Emily's stomach tightened. Who told you that? It's a small county. Denise said an echo of Crane's exact words 2 days earlier that made Emily's skin crawl. Word travels. I'd love to get a quote from you about what happened. I don't have anything to say right now, Emily said, and hung up before the reporter could push further unease settling deeper into her chest. Word was moving in directions she didn't like faster than she could control, and she didn't yet know whether that was Hawk's doing or Crane's, whether it would help her or bury her. By 8:30, Roger Pruitt's sedan rolled into the lot, and Emily felt her whole body go rigid at the sight of him climbing out, tablet in hand, that same rehearsed, unbothered smile on his face, like he hadn't spent the last 2 weeks quietly gutting her. Mrs. Carter, he said, I wanted to stop by personally and walk you through your appeal options given the final determination. You mean given the determination you helped rig? Emily said flatly. Pruitt's smile flickered, just barely the same tell she'd caught weeks earlier standing in this exact spot. I'm not sure what you're implying, but I'd strongly advise against making accusations you can't substantiate. That kind of talk can complicate things significantly for you. Complicate things, Emily repeated. Like they're not already complicated enough. Like a bank isn't foreclosing on land my husband's grandfather cleared with his own hands right around the same time Gordon Crane just happens to show up waving a check. Coincidences happen, Mrs. Carter. Pruitt's voice had lost its earlier warmth, entirely gone thin and clipped. I came here as a courtesy. If you'd rather handle this adversarially, that's your prerogative, but I promise you it won't end well for you. Get off my property. Emily said the second time in 2 days she'd said those exact words to a man in an expensive coat, and something about saying it twice made her feel less like a victim and more like a woman drawing a line she intended to hold. Pruitt left without another word, tires spitting gravel, and Emily stood alone again in the ruin of her lot, hard hammering, watching the clock on her phone tick toward 9, then 10, then 11, each hour dragging like wet cement, Crane's 5 o'clock deadline looming larger with every passing minute. She called Hawk twice that morning. Both times it rang through to nothing. No answer, no voicemail picking up, just endless ringing that made her chest tighten, with the fear she didn't want to name, the fear that she'd trusted a promise made in the exhausted, adrenaline-soaked aftermath of a tornado. A promise that men said and meant in the moment and simply couldn't keep once real life and real logistics got in the way. By noon, she was pacing. By 1, she'd opened the envelope, despite herself, just to look, just to remind herself what she was fighting against, and found the number even smaller than she remembered. Insultingly small, a number that treated 3 generations of Carter blood and sweat like a rounding error. She shoved it back in the envelope and threw it across the lot, watching it skid into the mud, and immediately felt a stab of panic at having done something so reckless with what might be her only real offer. Hold the line, she told herself, retrieving it, brushing off the mud, smoothing the creases like it mattered, like any of it mattered, if the man who told her to hold that line had already forgotten her the moment his bike disappeared down the highway. At 2:30, another car pulled into the lot, not Crane's sedan this time, but a county utility truck. And a man in a hard hat climbed out with a clipboard and an expression Emily was beginning to recognize as the universal look of someone about to deliver bad news they didn't personally feel responsible for. Mrs. Carter, I'm here about the property line dispute filing. The what? Emily said, her stomach dropping through the floor. I haven't filed anything. No, ma'am, the filing's against you. Crane Land Holdings submitted a boundary dispute this morning, claims your east fence line encroaches on adjacent parcel they acquired last year. Pending resolution, counties putting a hold on any permits for rebuild construction on that section. Emily stood absolutely still, feeling the trap tighten another notch. Understanding with sudden sick clarity exactly what was happening. Not one attack, but a dozen small ones arriving from every direction at once. Each one designed not to destroy her outright, but to exhaust her to make the alternative. Crane's shrinking offer looked more reasonable with every passing hour. This is insane, she said mostly to herself. This is absolutely insane. I just deliver the paperwork, ma'am, the utility man said, not unkindly, sliding the notice into her hands before retreating quickly to his truck, clearly wanting no part of whatever was unfolding on this property. Emily read the boundary dispute filing twice, her hands shaking, and felt something in her chest crack under the accumulated weight of it. The insurance denial. The foreclosure clock, the reporter calling about bikers like it was some kind of tabloid curiosity. And now this, a fabricated property dispute timed with surgical precision to arrive on the exact day Crane's offer expired. She sat down hard on the tailgate of her truck, the notice crumpling in her fist, and for the first time since the tornado itself, Emily Carter felt something close to despair. Not the sharp, immediate grief of loss, but the slow, grinding despair of watching a system built by powerful people quietly, methodically, close every door around her, one bureaucratic form at a time. Her phone buzzed. She nearly didn't answer it, certain it was another piece of bad news, another notice, another voice telling her time was running out. It was Hawk. Emily! His voice was rushed, urgent wind noise roaring behind him like he was riding at speed. Sorry I missed your calls. We've been moving fast all morning. Tell me what's happening right now. Emily's voice cracked as it all came pouring out. Pruitt's visit, the reporter's call, the boundary dispute, filing the permits, frozen the 5 o'clock deadline bearing down like a wall she couldn't see over. There was a beat of silence on the line filled only by wind. Emily, Hawk said, and his voice had gone hard again, the same flat, dangerous calm she'd heard the night before. I need you to look at the clock. What time is it there? Almost 3. Okay. A pause, muffled voices in the background, someone shouting something Emily couldn't make out. Okay, Emily, I need you to hold that line for 2 more hours, just 2. Can you do that? Hawk, there's a fabricated property dispute freezing my construction permits. There's a reporter asking questions I don't know how to answer. Crane's deadline is at 5. And if I don't have something to tell him... You don't need to tell him anything, Hawk said. You don't answer that man. You don't sign anything. You don't negotiate. You don't even open that door if he shows up. You understand? Hawk, what is happening? Emily's voice broke on the question, raw and exhausted. Please, just tell me what's happening. Another pause, longer this time. And when Hawk spoke again, there was something almost gentle underneath the urgency, something that steadied Emily, despite everything crumbling around her. What's happening, Hawk said, is that for the last 2 weeks, while you've been fighting this alone because you were too proud to make one more call, I've had people pulling every thread connected to Gordon Crane and Roger Pruitt across 4 counties. What's happening is that you weren't the first family they did this to, and you sure as hell aren't going to be the last one they get away with it on. What's happening, Emily, is that word doesn't just travel fast in this county. It travels fast on the interstate too, and there's a lot of interstate between here and where I am right now. Emily didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet. 2 hours, Hawk said again. Hold the line, please. The call ended, and Emily sat on the tailgate of her truck in the mud and wreckage of everything she'd built, staring at the crumpled boundary dispute notice in her fist, at the envelope of Crane's insulting offer sitting a few feet away where she dropped it and felt time slow down to something almost unbearable, each minute stretching long and thin like taffy pulled past its breaking point. At 3:30, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Jake Rookie, a name she hadn't heard from since he'd been loaded into the ambulance 2 weeks earlier. You holding up okay? Hawk's got everybody moving. You're going to want to be standing outside when it happens. Trust me. Emily stared at the message, confused unease, and something dangerously close to hope tangling together in her chest. When what happened, she typed back. No response came. At 4 o'clock, Gordon Crane's black sedan rolled back into the lot exactly as promised, exactly on schedule. And Emily felt her whole body go cold at the sight of him stepping out, that same gleaming, patient smile, fixed in place like he already knew how this was going to end. Mrs. Carter, he said, 1 hour left. I trust you have had time to think. I've had time to learn a great deal, Mr. Crane, Emily said, forcing steel into her voice, despite the exhaustion threatening to buckle her knees. About boundary disputes filed the same morning your offer expires. About adjustment firms with registered agents who share your company's address. About 3 other families in this county who got the exact same treatment you're giving me right now. Crane's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went very still, very cold. That's a dangerous game to play, Mrs. Carter. Accusations like that without proof tend to end badly for the person making them. Funny, Emily said. Somebody else said almost that exact same thing to me yesterday. Small county, I guess. Word travels. For just a moment, just one brief telling moment, Crane's composure cracked something ugly and impatient, flashing across his face before he smoothed it back into that same rehearsed calm. 1 hour, he said, checking an expensive watch on his wrist. After that, this offer is gone, the bank moves on the property, and you're left with nothing but a lawsuit you can't afford, and a story nobody with any actual power is going to believe. Think very carefully, Mrs. Carter. He turned and walked back toward his car, unhurried, supremely confident, a man who had clearly done this exact routine in enough times to know exactly how it always ended. That was when Emily heard it. At first, she thought it was her own pulse pounding too loud in her ears after a day of accumulated terror. But it kept building low and steady, a vibration she felt through the soles of her boots before she consciously registered it as sound. Crane heard it too. He stopped with one hand on his car door, head tilting, brow furrowing in mild irritation, like a man interrupted mid-sentence by something he hadn't planned for. What in the world? Emily whispered, turning toward the highway. The sound kept building. Not thunder, not the scream of a tornado. Something else entirely, a deep rolling roar that grew steadily louder, richer, more layered until it stopped sounding like a handful of engines and started sounding like something enormous. Something that made the ground itself seem to hum beneath her boots. "What is that?" Crane muttered, straightening up, squinting toward the horizon, where Route 9 curved out of sight behind a stand of storm-battered trees. Emily's heart began to pound so hard she could feel it in her throat. She thought absurdly impossibly of the night of the tornado, of standing in this exact spot, listening to a sound that shouldn't have belonged to a storm that turned out to be 27 motorcycles fighting through hurricane winds toward her shelter. This sound was bigger, immeasurably bigger. The first bikes came around the curve in the road, and then the second wave, and then it stopped being waves at all, and simply became a solid, unbroken river of motorcycles pouring down Route 9 toward Willow Creek Chrome, flashing in the late afternoon light, engines layering into a single continuous roar that shook loose bits of debris, still clinging to the wreckage around them. "That's not possible," Crane said. And for the first time since he'd first pulled into her lot 2 weeks earlier, Emily heard something crack in his voice. Not confidence, but the beginning of real, genuine alarm. Emily stood frozen, one hand pressed against her chest, watching a wall of motorcycles stretch back further than she could see, further than the curve of the highway, allowed her to track riders in formation, colors, and patches from clubs and chapters. She'd never heard of a river of leather and chrome that kept coming and showed no sign of ending. 27, she whispered, remembering the night in the shelter, remembering counting heads in the dark. This isn't 27. It wasn't. It wasn't 100 either. As the first riders began peeling off the highway into what remained of her lot, engines idling down to a low, steady growl, more kept coming behind them, an endless procession that seemed to have no bottom to it, filling the road as far back as Emily could see, filling the air with a sound so massive it seemed to press against her ribs. Leading the pack, unmistakable even at a distance, was Hawk. He rode straight and steady at the front of the formation, and as he drew closer, Emily could see the exhaustion in his face, the road dust caked into the creases of his jacket, a man who had clearly ridden hard and far and fast to be standing here at this exact moment. He pulled to a stop directly in front of her, killed the engine, and swung off the bike in one smooth, deliberate motion, his eyes finding hers, immediately steady and certain in a way that made 3 weeks of terror and exhaustion finally start to loosen its grip on Emily's chest. "Told you to hold the line," Hawk said. Emily couldn't speak. She could only stare past him at the seemingly endless river of motorcycles still pouring off the highway, filling every inch of the lot and spilling out into the field beyond, engines cutting off one by one until the roar softened into something almost like a held breath. Hundreds, and then over 1,000 riders, dismounting in near-perfect disciplined silence. "Hawk," she finally managed. "What is this? What did you do?" "I made some calls," Hawk said simply. Turns out a lot of people wanted to answer. Crane, still standing frozen by his car door, had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. His earlier confidence entirely evaporated and replaced by something that looked for the first time like genuine fear. This is a public road," he stammered, finding his voice, though it carried none of its earlier polish. "This is harassment. I'll have every one of you arrested for trespassing, for intimidation." "This is a woman's private property," Hawk said, turning toward him, slowly, his voice carrying easily across the sudden heavy quiet that had fallen over the lot. "And every man and woman standing here has been personally invited by the owner. Isn't that right, Emily?" Emily looked at Crane, at the fear finally cracking through his practiced composure, and felt something rise in her chest that wasn't quite triumph, not yet, but was undeniably powerfully close to it. "That's right," she said, her voice steady now, stronger than it had been in weeks. "Every one of them." "You come," Crane started, then stopped, visibly recalculating, his eyes darting across the impossible sea of leather and chrome surrounding his sedan on every side. "This doesn't change anything. The bank still forecloses. The insurance determination still stands. You can bring 1,000 bikers here, Mrs. Carter, and it won't change a single piece of paperwork." 1,680, Hawk said quietly. Crane blinked. "What? 1,680 riders?" Hawk repeated, and something in his voice had gone razor sharp, precise, a man laying a card on the table he'd been holding for exactly the right moment. From 41 chapters across 9 states, some of them drove 12 hours straight to be standing here right now. "You want to know why, Mr. Crane?" Crane didn't answer. He looked for the first time like a man who understood he was standing in water far over his head. Because while you and your friend Pruitt were busy squeezing this woman for every last cent you could steal from her, Hawk continued, his voice carrying easily across the silent crowd. Some of my brothers, who happen to have a background in forensic accounting, were busy pulling every single filing connected to Crane Land Holdings for the last 5 years. And what they found, Mr. Crane, is a very interesting pattern. He nodded, and a rider near the front of the crowd, a woman gray-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing a vest that read SGT at arms beneath a patch Emily didn't recognize, stepped forward holding a thick folder. Denise Alvarez, the woman said, extending a hand toward a figure Emily hadn't even noticed step out of the crowd, the same reporter Emily realized with a jolt, who had called her that morning asking about bikers. Caddo County Gazette. I got an interesting tip a few hours ago about a pattern of storm-damaged properties being systematically undervalued by a specific adjustment firm, then bought up cheap by a holding company with some very curious ties to that same firm. Crane's face had gone from pale to something closer to gray. This is defamation. It's public record, actually, the reporter said, flipping open her own notepad. 3 other families in this county, all with strikingly similar stories to Mrs. Carter's. Would you like to comment on the record, Mr. Crane? Or should I just print what I already have? Crane's mouth opened and closed twice, no sound coming out, and Emily watched the last of his composure crumble entirely as he looked around at the sea of faces surrounding him. 1,000 riders, a reporter with a notepad, and Emily Carter standing squarely between him and his car. No longer the desperate, cornered widow he'd spent 2 weeks so carefully, methodically preying upon. I don't have to stand here for this, Crane finally managed, yanking his car door open. No, Hawk agreed evenly, you don't. But you should know before you go that copies of everything we found, every filing, every matching address, every denied claim that lines up a little too perfectly with one of your purchase offers, those are already sitting on the desk of the State Insurance Commissioner's office as of about 2 hours ago, along with the county DA, along with, as it happens, a couple of reporters at outlets a good deal bigger than the Gazette. Crane froze half in his car, one hand white-knuckled on the doorframe. That's not, you can't, we can, and we did, Hawk said. Turns out a club with 41 chapters has a lot of resources when it decides to use them on behalf of somebody who earned it. You've got a long few months coming, Mr. Crane. I'd start with a good lawyer, and I'd start soon. Crane didn't say another word. He dropped into his sedan, slammed the door hard enough that the sound cracked across the silent lot like a gunshot, and reversed out through a corridor of parted motorcycles that closed silently, deliberately behind him as he fled down Route 9 tires, spitting gravel taillights, shrinking fast into the distance. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily stood in the middle of her ruined lot, surrounded by more motorcycles than she had ever imagined existed in one place, and felt the full staggering weight of what had just happened finally crash down over her all at once. Her knees buckled. Hawk caught her before she hit the ground, one strong arm around her shoulders, steadying her the same way he had at the hatch 3 weeks earlier. The same way he'd been steadying her, she realized now, in every possible sense ever since. I've got you, he said quietly. You held the line. It's over. It's not over, Emily said, her voice shaking, tears finally breaking free after weeks of holding them back. The bank, the foreclosure, I still don't have anywhere to. Emily. Hawk's voice was gentle but absolutely certain, cutting cleanly through her spiraling panic. Look around you. Emily lifted her head, wiping at her eyes, and really looked at the sea of faces surrounding her. Weathered and tattooed and rain-scarred men and women who had ridden hundreds of miles on nothing but a phone call, and a story about a widow who'd opened her door to strangers in a storm. There's not a foreclosure notice in this county that survives what happens next, Hawk said. There's not a bank that forecloses on a property when 41 chapters and a state investigation are both watching. And there's not an insurance company in the state that wants their name anywhere near what Pruitt's about to have coming for him. I don't understand, Emily whispered. Jake Rookie pushed his way through the crowd, just then still favoring his healing legs slightly, a wide, exhausted, delighted grin on his young face. He means we've got this, Jake said. All of it, every single piece of it. Emily looked from Jake to Hawk to the massive silent crowd surrounding her, 1,680 riders who had answered a phone call because a woman had once looked at 27 strangers in the middle of a tornado and chosen kindness over fear, and felt something break open in her chest. That had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the debt she was only now beginning to understand the true size of. Why? She managed finally, her voice barely a whisper. Why would all of you come for me? Hawk was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression that held none of the calculating hardness he'd shown Crane, only something warm, something certain, something that had been building since the night he'd watched her dig barehanded through the wreckage of her own life for a single photograph. You opened your door when everyone else would have closed theirs, Hawk said, loud enough now that the words carried across the entire silent crowd across 1,680 riders who had come from 9 states to hear him say it. You saved our brothers. Now we're here to save you. A rumble of agreement rolled through the crowd, low and unified, and somewhere behind her, Emily heard the reporter's pen scratching fast against her notepad, already writing the story that would within a week travel far beyond the borders of Caddo County. The bikers revealed something more. Hawk continued, turning to address the crowd now as much as Emily, his voice carrying the weight of a promise he'd clearly been building toward since the moment he first pulled that scrap of paper from his vest 3 weeks earlier. They came together because chapters across this entire country heard what one woman did for 27 strangers, and every single one of them understood something simple. A debt like that isn't measured in money. It's measured in showing up, and we showed up. Emily looked out over the crowd, over the motorcycles filling every inch of her ruined lot and spilling into the field beyond, over faces she'd never seen before that had traveled hundreds of miles for her, over Jake's grin and the reporter's notepad and Hawk's steady, unwavering presence beside her, and felt for the first time since the sirens had screamed through Willow Creek 3 weeks earlier, something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with hope. I don't know how to thank 1,680 people, she said, her voice thick with tears she no longer tried to hold back. You already did, Hawk said quietly. 3 weeks ago in a storm, when you opened a door, nobody would have blamed you for closing. The sun was beginning to sink low toward the flattened horizon, painting the endless sea of motorcycles in long streaks of gold and amber. And Emily Carter stood in the middle of it all, in the wreckage of everything she'd lost, and the impossible, overwhelming beginning of everything she was about to gain, and understood with a clarity that settled deep into her bones that whatever came next, she would never again face it standing entirely alone. The crowd didn't disperse as the sun dropped lower. If anything, it settled deeper into the lot riders finding places to stand or sit on overturned crates in the hoods of their bikes, a strange and improbable stillness, falling over 1,680 people who had ridden hundreds of miles and now seemed content simply to be present to bear witness to whatever came next. Hawk reached into the saddlebag of his motorcycle and pulled out a thick envelope considerably heavier than the one Crane had left sitting on Emily's truck the day before. He held it out to her with both hands the way a man hands over something he considers sacred. Before you say anything, he said, I need you to understand what this is and what it isn't. Emily stared at the envelope, her hands trembling as she took it, unable to make herself open it yet. Hawk, I already told you I don't need... It's not charity, Ushui, Hawk said, cutting her off gently but firmly. The same words he'd used 3 weeks earlier, said now with even more weight behind them. 41 chapters past a hat. Every single rider standing in this lot right now put something into that envelope before we ever left our own towns. This isn't me deciding to help you, Emily. This is 1,680 people deciding together that a debt gets paid. Emily opened the flap with shaking fingers and felt her breath catch entirely at what she found inside. Not just cash, though there was more of it than she'd seen in one place in her entire life, but also a cashier's check folded neatly on top, made out directly to her. Hawk, she whispered, this is enough to clear the loan. This is enough to clear the loan and rebuild both buildings and still have money left over. That's the idea, Hawk said simply. I can't accept this. You already did, Jake said, grinning from where he stood a few feet away, still favoring his leg, but steadier now than he'd been 3 weeks earlier. It's already in your hands. Emily looked around at the crowd, at faces weathered by road and wind, and years of being misjudged by people who never bothered to look past the leather, and felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a gratitude too enormous to hold inside her body. I don't know what to say, she finally managed. Don't say anything yet, Hawk said, because that's not all of it. He turned and gestured toward the back of the massive formation of motorcycles and Emily watched as the crowd parted to reveal a line of flatbed trucks she hadn't even noticed arrive stacked high with lumber steel roofing panels, pallets of concrete, mixed coils of wiring, everything a person would need to raise a building from nothing. "We didn't just bring money," Hawk said. "We brought hands." A man stepped forward from near the trucks, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, a tool belt already slung over one shoulder like he'd been waiting all day for permission to put it on. "Name's Deacon," he said, extending a hand to Emily. 22 years, a union electrician before I retired. Got about a dozen more like me back there, carpenters, a couple of plumbers, a fellow who used to run his own concrete company down in Texas. We figured you might need the help." Behind him, more riders began stepping forward, introducing themselves one by one, and Emily realized with a dawning, overwhelming clarity that this wasn't simply a gesture of gratitude. This was an army of skilled hands, tradesmen, and craftsmen who had spent their lives building things, all of them here, all of them ready to work. "This is too much," Emily said, her voice breaking. "All of this, it's too much." "Ma'am," Deacon said, not unkindly, "with respect, I don't think you understand what you did for us. You think a tornado's the only storm we've ever ridden through. Half these men have been in real storms, bad ones, the kind that leave people broken and alone with nobody willing to help because of a patch on a vest. You didn't see a patch. You saw people who needed help. Don't you dare tell us this is too much." Emily wiped at her eyes, unable to argue with that, unable to argue with any of it, and simply nodded, clutching the envelope to her chest the way she'd clutched Daniel's photograph in the wreckage 3 weeks earlier. "Okay," she said. "Okay, where do we start?" That question set into motion a transformation Emily could never have imagined possible. They started the next morning before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon. Emily woke to the sound of engines and hammers, dozens of riders already at work clearing the last of the debris, sorting salvageable materials from ruin, laying out string lines across the foundation where the shop had once stood. She stumbled out of the shelter, rubbing sleep from her eyes, to find Hawk already directing traffic like a foreman who'd run job sites his entire life, which she would learn over the coming days he actually had decades earlier before the road had claimed him entirely. "You didn't have to start this early," she said, handing him a cup of the same weak instant coffee she'd been surviving on for weeks. "Storm season doesn't wait for people to catch up on sleep," Hawk said, taking the cup with a small, tired smile. "Figured we shouldn't either." Word spread through Willow Creek faster even than it had spread about the tornado itself. By mid-morning, townspeople had begun gathering at the edge of the property, drawn by the impossible sight of over 1,000 motorcycles parked across the Carter land and dozens of leather-clad bikers hammering, sawing, hauling lumber with the kind of practiced efficiency that put most construction crews to shame. Emily noticed the way people watched from a careful distance. At first, the same wary uncertainty she'd felt herself the night of the storm, whispered conversations behind cupped hands, a few outright stares that carried more judgment than curiosity. One woman, an older neighbor Emily recognized from church, though they'd never spoken much, finally approached around noon, arms crossed tight over her chest. "Emily, honey, are you safe out here with all these people?" the woman asked, voice pitched low, like she didn't want to be overheard, eyes flicking nervously toward a cluster of tattooed riders unloading lumber 20 feet away. Emily set down the tool belt she'd borrowed and looked the woman steadily in the eye. "Mrs. Dawson, these men carried 3 injured brothers through a tornado to get to my shelter. They've spent the last 3 weeks fighting a corrupt insurance adjuster and a predatory land developer on my behalf without me even asking them to. And right now they're rebuilding my home with their own hands and their own money, free of charge. I have never in my life felt safer than I do standing in this lot with them." Mrs. Dawson's mouth opened, then closed clearly, unprepared for the force of Emily's answer. "I just worry," she started again, softer now. "I know," Emily said, and her voice gentle too, understanding the fear wasn't malicious, just old, just inherited from a lifetime of headlines and warnings that had never once bothered to ask the actual people wearing the patches what they were really like. "But you're welcome to stay and watch. Maybe you'll see something different than what you expected." Mrs. Dawson hesitated. Then, to Emily's quiet surprise, pulled a folding chair from the back of her car and set it up at the edge of the lot, watching the work unfold through the rest of the afternoon in careful, thoughtful silence. She wasn't the only one. By the second day, a small crowd of townspeople had gathered regularly along the fence line, some out of curiosity, some out of genuine concern for Emily, most simply unable to look away from the strange, powerful sight of over 1,000 bikers laboring from sunrise to sunset to rebuild a stranger's life. The framing for the new shop went up in 4 days flat, faster than Emily could have imagined possible, even with a full professional crew and unlimited budget. Deacon ran the electrical work with military precision, barking good-natured orders at a rotating crew of volunteers who seemed to genuinely enjoy being barked at. A woman named Sadie, one of the few female riders in the massive convoy, turned out to be a licensed contractor back in Missouri and took over general oversight of the build with an authority that made even the most weathered old bikers fall into line without complaint. Emily found herself constantly moving between roles, handing out tools, fetching water, answering questions about where things had originally stood so the rebuild could honor the shop's original layout, and increasingly simply talking. Really talking in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in the 3 long years since Daniel's death. She told Jake about the day Daniel proposed to her right there in the old bay grease on both their hands, no ring because he'd spent his last dollar on a transmission part for a customer who couldn't afford to tow their car anywhere else. She told Deacon about the winter Daniel had rebuilt the shop's ancient furnace from spare parts because they couldn't afford a new one working through Christmas Eve so the pipes wouldn't freeze. She told Sadie quietly, one evening while they were framing the last wall of the apartment upstairs about the morning, she'd found Daniel on the kitchen floor about the 3 days she'd spent afterward, unable to make herself walk back into their bedroom. You don't have to keep pushing through this alone anymore, Sadie said, simply driving a nail with 3 efficient strikes of her hammer. That's kind of the whole point of all this. It was on the 5th day that the twist came. Emily was up on a ladder helping hang new drywall in what would become the shop's front office when Hawk's phone rang, and she watched from her perch as his expression shifted from casual to sharply focused in the span of a single sentence. Say that again, he said into the phone, voice tight. Slow down. The hammering around them slowed, then stopped entirely. Riders sensing the shift in Hawk's posture the way soldiers sense a change in weather. Emily climbed down the ladder, heart already hammering, half convinced Crane had found some new way to strike. What is it? She asked when Hawk finally lowered the phone. That was Denise, the reporter. Hawk's jaw was tight, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. The story ran this morning, front page state edition, not just the county paper. Okay, Emily said slowly. Is that bad? It's not bad, Hawk said. It's about to get very complicated very fast. He was right. Within the hour, Emily's phone, the same phone that had barely rung in 3 years except for bill collectors, and the occasional customer, began buzzing, constantly numbers she didn't recognize. Voicemails piling up faster than she could listen to them. A local news van pulled up to the edge of the property by early afternoon, a reporter and cameraman climbing out with the eager energy of people who smelled a story bigger than a simple storm recovery piece. Mrs. Carter, can we get a statement about the allegations against Crane Land Holdings? The reporter called out, microphone already extended as Emily approached the fence line reluctantly. Hawk, a steady presence at her shoulder. I don't have anything prepared, Emily said, startled by the sudden attention. Is it true that over 1,600 motorcyclists showed up to stop a fraudulent land grab? The reporter pressed. Can you confirm the insurance commissioner's office has opened a formal investigation into adjuster Roger Pruitt? Emily glanced at Hawk, uncertain, and he gave her a small, steady nod, the same silent confidence he'd offered her the night of the tornado when she'd hesitated at the door. Everything in that article is true, Emily said, turning back to the camera, her voice finding steadiness she didn't know she still had. I lost my home and my family's business in the storm, and instead of helping me rebuild the people who were supposed to help my insurance adjuster, a land developer circling my property, they tried to take advantage of a woman who just lost everything. And when I had nowhere else to turn, the same men I sheltered during that tornado came back and stood beside me. That's the whole story. That's all any of this ever was. The reporter pressed for more, but Hawk stepped in smoothly, polite, but immovable, redirecting the crew towards statements from Deacon and Sadie about the rebuild itself, buying Emily space to step back, hands shaking, overwhelmed by a spotlight she'd never once asked for. That evening, sitting on an overturned crate near the newly framed shop, exhaustion finally catching up with her, Emily turned to Hawk with a question that had been building in her chest all day. Is this going to cause trouble for you? For the club, all this attention. Hawk considered the question for a long moment, watching the last riders wrapping up the day's work in the fading light. Emily, you need to understand something about people like Crane and Pruitt, he said. Men like that survive by operating where nobody's looking. The moment a light gets shined on what they're doing, most of the fear they rely on just evaporates. This story running isn't trouble for us. It's the opposite. It means people like Crane can't do this to the next family, the next widow, without somebody remembering what happened here. And the club, doesn't this kind of attention usually work against you? People already assume the worst about bikers. Some will keep assuming the worst no matter what we do, Hawk said. That's never going to change completely, and I stopped losing sleep over that a long time ago. But every person who reads that article and sees 1,680 of us rebuilding a stranger's house instead of tearing something down, that's one more person who might actually stop and think twice before judging the next patch they see coming down the highway. Emily was quiet for a moment, watching the darkening sky, the first stars beginning to prick through above the skeleton of her half-finished new home. Mrs. Dawson brought a casserole today. She finally said, a small, disbelieving laugh escaping her. The woman who asked me 3 days ago if I was safe out here. She brought a casserole and sat with Sadie for 2 hours talking about quilting patterns. Hawk laughed low and warm, a sound Emily was beginning to realize she looked forward to hearing. Told you, people just need a reason to look a little closer. The investigation into Pruitt and Crane accelerated faster than anyone anticipated. 2 days after the article ran, the State Insurance Commissioner's office issued a formal statement confirming an active fraud investigation into the adjustment firm connected to Pruitt, citing a pattern of manipulated pre-existing condition flags across at least 6 storm-damaged properties in the region. By the end of that same week, county prosecutors had opened a parallel investigation into Craneland Holdings for suspected collusion in predatory acquisition practices. Pruitt was placed on administrative leave within days, his name and photograph appearing in a follow-up article alongside a growing list of families who had come forward once Emily's story broke the silence that had kept them each isolated in their own private shame and defeat. I thought it was just me, the elderly woman Emily had spoken to weeks earlier told her over the phone, voice thick with emotion. I thought I was the only one foolish enough to fall for it. I didn't know there were others. I didn't know anybody would ever believe me. You weren't foolish, Emily told her. You were targeted. There's a difference, and it's not a small one. The woman's claim, along with 2 others, was reopened for full reassessment. Within the month, the artificial pre-existing condition flags removed once investigators confirmed the pattern Emily had first noticed, staring at case reference numbers by flashlight in the bottom of her storm shelter. Craneland Holdings' business license was suspended pending investigation. Gordon Crane himself, according to Denise's increasingly detailed follow-up reporting, had reportedly retained a defense attorney out of Oklahoma City and had not been seen publicly in Caddo County since the day 1,680 motorcycles rolled down Route 9 and closed a corridor around his car. Emily read every article twice, sitting on the newly poured front steps of her rebuilt shop in the evenings, feeling something settle inside her that she could only describe as justice. Not loud, not triumphant, just quiet and solid and real. The simple, steady satisfaction of watching a wrong finally properly answered. The bank, for its part, moved with unusual speed once the cashier's check cleared the foreclosure notice, formally withdrawn within 72 hours. The branch manager, who had once delivered cold-clipped warnings over the phone, now calling personally to apologize for what he called an unfortunate misunderstanding regarding timeline flexibility. Funny how flexible timelines get once somebody's paying attention, Emily said dryly to Hawk after that call, and he laughed, shaking his head. Welcome to how the world actually works, he said. Money and attention, 2 things people like Crane count on regular folks never having enough of. The rebuild continued through the following 2 weeks at a pace that still, even watching it unfold day by day, struck Emily as something close to miraculous. The shop's new bay doors went up electric-powered, this time courtesy of Deacon's insistence that no widow should ever have to crank a door by hand again if I've got anything to say about it. The apartment above was reframed larger than the original. An extra window added at Sadie's suggestion to let more morning light into what would become Emily's new bedroom. It was during the reconstruction of that upstairs space that Emily found herself alone with Hawk for the first time in days, the rest of the crew having broken for a late lunch. The two of them finishing the trim work around the new window in a comfortable, companionable quiet that had grown between them over the past weeks without either of them quite noticing when it started. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said, running a hand along the fresh wood of the window frame. "Always. Why you out of everybody in that shelter that night? Why were you the one who kept coming back?" The phone calls, the promise, all of this. She gestured around the half-finished room. "You didn't have to be the one carrying all this." Hawk set down his tools, considering the question with the same careful weight he seemed to give everything. 20 years ago," he said slowly. "I was the one drowning. Wife left, took my daughter with her, told the courts I wasn't fit because of the patch on my back. Never mind. I'd never so much as raised my voice at either of them. Lost my job not long after some corporate restructuring that conveniently happened to target the guy with tattoos on his knuckles. I was about as low as a man gets, Emily, ready to give up on all of it." Emily stayed quiet, sensing there was more, letting him find it in his own time. "A woman gave me a job when nobody else would," Hawk continued. "Ran a diner outside Tulsa. Didn't care what I looked like, just cared that I showed up on time and worked hard. Never told me why she did it. Never asked for anything back. 3 years later, her place caught fire. Insurance wouldn't cover half of what she lost. Same kind of story you've been living the last month. I organized 11 guys back then. 11. Rebuilt her diner in 2 weeks." He paused. "That's when I understood what the patch on my back it was actually supposed to mean. Not the outlaw stuff people assume. The Brotherhood. The idea that when somebody shows you kindness with nothing to gain from it, you don't let that debt sit unanswered." "So this," Emily said quietly, "this is you paying forward what she gave you. This is me recognizing the same kind of person." Hawk said, his eyes finding hers steadily in the afternoon light slanting through the new window. "You didn't open that shelter because you thought you'd get something out of it, Emily. You did it because it was right there in front of you, and you couldn't live with yourself if you didn't. That's rare. That's worth protecting." Something passed between them in that quiet, unfinished room, something neither of them named out loud, but that Emily carried with her for the rest of the afternoon, warm and unfamiliar, in a chest that had spent 3 years carefully guarded against exactly this kind of feeling. The final push toward completion came together in a single extraordinary week. Riders who had gone home to their own families in the days after the initial standoff with Crane began trickling back as word spread of the rebuild's progress, some driving hundreds of miles simply to spend a weekend hammering shingles or hauling drywall before heading home again. The shop's new sign frame went up on a Thursday, though the sign itself remained blank. "Waiting," Hawk explained mysteriously, "for Emily to decide what it should say." "It's always said Carter's Roadside Repair," Emily said, staring up at the empty frame. "I don't know why it would say anything different now." "You don't have to decide today," Hawk said. "But this place isn't quite the same as it was before the storm, is it?" Emily considered that, looking around at the transformed lot, the rebuilt shop standing stronger and better equipped than the original had ever been. The community of townspeople who now gathered regularly along the fence line, not out of wary curiosity, but genuine warmth. The small folding table Mrs. Dawson had taken to setting up most afternoons with lemonade for the crew. The friendships that had formed in a matter of weeks between people who, 3 months earlier, would have crossed the street rather than acknowledge each other's existence. "No," she admitted, "it's not the same at all." The community center addition, an idea that had first been floated almost as a joke by Sadie during a lunch break, took shape faster than anyone expected once the momentum caught. A separate structure adjacent to the shop, built from the same reclaimed and new materials, designed to serve as exactly what Willow Creek had desperately needed since the storm first tore through, a place for displaced families to gather, receive donated supplies. Connect with resources the county's overwhelmed emergency services couldn't always provide fast enough. Mrs. Dawson, of all people, became one of its most enthusiastic organizers, coordinating a donation drive among the same neighbors who had once eyed the bikers with suspicion, now working alongside them to stock shelves with canned goods and blankets and children's clothing for families still recovering from the tornado's wider damage across the county. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Dawson admitted to Emily one afternoon, watching 2 heavily tattooed riders carefully organizing donated toys by age group, with the gentle precision of men who clearly had grandchildren of their own waiting back home. "Guess I had some things wrong about people." "Most folks do," Emily said, "until something forces them to look closer." The transformation wasn't just physical. Emily watched it happen in the eyes of people across Willow Creek. The slow, steady erosion of assumptions that had stood unquestioned for years, replaced by something more honest, more complicated, more true. The Sheriff Whitfield, who had eyed the crowd with such wariness the morning after the tornado, now stopped by regularly, sometimes bringing coffee for the crew. Once staying nearly 2 hours trading old motorcycle stories with Deacon, that left both men laughing so hard Emily could hear it clear across the lot. It wasn't that the town had simply decided to like the Hells Angels, Emily understood. It was something deeper than that, something that mattered more. They had simply stopped assuming they already knew who these men were before actually meeting them. 3 weeks after the article first broke on a bright, clear afternoon that felt almost deliberately chosen by whatever force governs such things, Emily stood in the finished bay of her rebuilt shop. Running her hand along a workbench Deacon had built to match almost exactly the one Daniel had built with his own hands over a decade earlier. "It's not the same shop," she said quietly to Hawk, who had come to stand beside her. "No," he agreed. "It's better wired, better insulated, and it's got a door that opens on a switch instead of a hand crank that'll throw your back out one of these days." Emily laughed, wiping at unexpected tears. "That's not what I meant." "I know," Hawk said gently. "But I think Daniel would understand what it means either way. A place built by people who cared enough to show up standing on the same ground his family worked for 3 generations. That's not a replacement, Emily. That's a continuation." Emily nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and looked out through the open bay door at the lot beyond, no longer a wasteland of splintered lumber and twisted metal, but something whole again. Something rebuilt, not just in wood and steel, but in the fabric of an entire community that had been quietly permanently changed by one decision made in the middle of a storm. Above the door, the sign frame still waited, blank, patient, ready for whatever name Emily finally chose to give this new chapter of a story that had started with a tornado and somehow impossibly become something far larger than either destruction or grief had any right to allow. The weeks that followed the shop's completion moved with a strange, gentle rhythm Emily hadn't felt in years. Not the frantic survival mode of the storm's aftermath, not the constant vigilance of fighting Crane and Pruitt, but something closer to peace, if peace was even the right word for a life that still felt so unfamiliar in its fullness. She was elbow deep in a transmission one Tuesday morning, customers trickling back. Now that word had spread, the shop was open again when her phone buzzed with a call from a number she'd started to dread on instinct alone, the county courthouse. "Mrs. Carter, this is the clerk's office. I wanted to give you advance notice the Craneland Holdings case has been scheduled for a preliminary hearing next month. Given your involvement, the DA's office would like to discuss your willingness to testify." Emily wiped grease from her hands, heart picking up its old, familiar, anxious rhythm. Testify against Crane and potentially Mr. Pruitt as well, given the connected nature of the charges. "I know this might feel like reopening old wounds, but your testimony could be significant." Emily was quiet for a long moment, staring out through the open bay door at the lot where just weeks earlier, 1,680 motorcycles had filled every inch of gravel and grass in an act of loyalty she still sometimes had trouble believing had actually happened. "I'll do it," she said finally. "Whatever it takes to make sure he can't do this to anybody else." She hung up and found Hawk leaning in the doorway, having clearly caught the tail end of the conversation, his expression carrying the particular stillness he wore whenever something serious was unfolding. "They want you in court," he said. It wasn't a question. "Next month. Preliminary hearing." Emily set down her wrench, suddenly aware of how much her hands were shaking. "Hawk, what if it doesn't work? What if he gets some slick lawyer and slides right out of this the same way men like him always seem to?" Hawk crossed the bay and took both her hands in his, steadying them the same way he'd steadied her that first night at the hatch in the middle of a storm that felt now like it had happened to 2 entirely different people. "Then you'll have done everything in your power to stop him," he said, "and that matters whatever happens after." But Emily, men like Crane don't usually survive this kind of daylight. Denise's follow-up piece ran in 3 additional papers this week. The insurance commissioner's office has 2 more former employees of Pruitt's firm cooperating with investigators. This isn't a small fire anymore. It's a wildfire, and it's not going out. Emily exhaled slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders, though not all of it. "I just want it to be over. I want to stop thinking about him every time my phone rings." It will be, Hawk said. Soon. I promise you that. That promise was tested 2 days later in a way Emily hadn't anticipated. She was closing up the shop for the evening when a car she didn't recognize pulled into the lot, not Crane's sleek black sedan, but an older, more modest vehicle, and the man who stepped out of it moved with none of Crane's practiced confidence. He looked, if anything, exhausted, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting nervously toward the shop before he seemed to force himself forward. "Mrs. Carter," he called out. My name is Alan Pruitt. Roger's my brother." Emily's whole body went rigid. Behind her, she heard Hawk's footsteps slow, felt him move a half step closer, present, but not intervening, letting her decide how to handle this. "I don't have anything to say to your brother's family," Emily said, her voice tight. "I'm not here for him," Alan said quickly. Hands raised slightly, a gesture of surrender rather than threat. "I'm here because I worked for that same firm for 6 years, Mrs. Carter. I quit 2 months before the storm hit. I've been trying to get someone to listen to what was happening there for over a year before that. Nobody believed me. Nobody wanted to touch it." Emily glanced at Hawk, uncertain, and he gave her the same small, steady nod he always did, trusting her judgment, even in moments that clearly put every protective instinct in his body on alert. "What do you want, Mr. Pruitt?" Emily asked. "I want to testify," Alan said, his voice cracking slightly. "I have records. Emails, internal memos going back years showing exactly how this scheme worked, how many families they targeted, how deliberately it was built. I was too scared to come forward before. I watched what happened here, what you did, and He stopped, swallowing hard. "I figured if a woman who lost everything could stand up to all of this, I didn't have much of an excuse left." Emily felt something complicated move through her chest. Not quite forgiveness, not for Roger, not yet. Maybe not ever, but something adjacent to hope. The recognition that even inside the machinery that had tried to destroy her, there were people capable of choosing differently when finally given a reason to. "Talk to the DA's office," Emily said. "May tell them everything. And Mr. Pruitt," she paused. "Thank you for finally choosing to." Alan nodded, visibly relieved, and left as quickly as he'd arrived, and Emily stood in the settling dust of his departure, feeling the ground shift slightly beneath the entire case. Felt the weight of what was coming for Crane and Roger Pruitt grow immeasurably heavier. "That's not a small thing," Hawk said quietly beside her. "An insider with documentation. That's the kind of testimony that ends careers, ends freedom, potentially, depending on what those records show." "Good," Emily said, and was surprised by how little hesitation lived in the word. The preliminary hearing arrived faster than Emily felt ready for a gray Tuesday morning, in a courthouse 2 counties over, the kind of sterile fluorescent-lit room that made every emotion feel simultaneously too large and too small for the space. Emily sat in the gallery beside Hawk, her hands twisted together in her lap, watching Gordon Crane enter through a side door flanked by 2 lawyers in suits that probably cost more than her old shop's entire annual insurance premium. He looked different than she remembered, smaller somehow, stripped of the sleek confidence he'd worn like armor every time he'd pulled into her lot. His eyes swept the gallery, once found Emily's, and something flickered across his face that might have been anger, might have been fear, might have simply been the recognition of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the world he'd built his entire scheme upon had finally irreversibly cracked. Roger Pruitt entered separately a few minutes later, alone, no lawyer beside him yet, visible his posture carrying the particular defeat of a man who understood exactly how much trouble he was in. The hearing itself moved with the slow, methodical grind Emily had expected, but still found excruciating to sit through. Motions, procedural arguments, the DA, laying out the preliminary case with a folder of evidence that had grown. Emily learned with quiet satisfaction to include not just her own testimony and financial records, but Alan Pruitt's internal documentation matching filings from 3 other victimized families, and forensic accounting reports connecting Crane Land Holdings acquisitions directly to Pruitt's manipulated claims with a precision that left even Crane's lawyers visibly recalculating their strategy in real time. When Emily was finally called to testify, her legs felt unsteady beneath her as she rose, but Hawk's hand brushed her shoulder briefly as she passed, and she carried that steadiness with her all the way to the witness stand. "Mrs. Carter," the DA began, "can you describe for the court what happened on the night of the tornado and in the weeks that followed?" Emily told it plainly, without embellishment, the same way she'd have described a repair job to a customer, The storm, the shelter, the 27 strangers, the devastation she'd found waiting for her when she'd finally climbed back into daylight. She described Pruitt's visit, the pre-existing condition, flagged Crane's offer arriving, with suspiciously specific knowledge of her financial situation, the boundary dispute filed the exact morning his deadline expired. "And what happened next, Mrs. Carter?" the DA asked. Emily glanced just briefly toward the gallery, toward Hawk, sitting with his hands folded, watching her with quiet, unwavering pride. 1,680 people showed up, she said simply. People who'd never met me before the night of that storm. People this whole country's been taught to fear and judge without ever actually meeting them. They didn't just stand beside me. They found the truth. Mr. Crane and Mr. Pruitt had spent years hiding, and they made sure it couldn't be buried anymore. Crane's lawyer objected to the characterization, and the judge sustained it. But Emily saw the damage had already been done, saw two jurors because it had by then escalated to a full jury proceeding exchange, a look that told her everything she needed to know about which side of this story they believed. The cross-examination was brutal in its own quiet way. Crane's lawyer trying repeatedly to paint Emily as an unreliable narrator, a grieving widow who had misunderstood ordinary business practices, who had been manipulated by outside parties with their own agenda. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Carter," the lawyer pressed, "that you had significant financial motivation to construct this narrative? That accusing my client of fraud was considerably more profitable than simply accepting a fair market offer?" Emily felt anger rise sharp and clean in her chest, and for once she let it show. Let her voice carry the full weight of 3 weeks spent fighting alone before anyone had come to stand beside her. "I didn't construct anything," she said, meeting the lawyer's gaze directly. "I found matching business addresses in public county records. I found a pattern across 4 families who'd never spoken to each other before I started asking questions. I didn't need to construct a narrative, sir. Your client and Mr. Pruitt already wrote it themselves. I just finally read it." A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel, and the lawyer, visibly rattled, retreated to a different line of questioning that gained no further traction. By the time Emily stepped down from the stand, she felt something settle inside her that she hadn't fully realized had still been unresolved. Not just the fear of losing the case, but the deeper fear that had haunted her since the tornado first tore through to Willow Creek. The fear that speaking her own truth plainly and without apology simply wouldn't be enough against people with more money and more power than she'd ever have. It was enough. She could feel it in the room, in the shifted expressions of the jury, in Crane's lawyers huddling in increasingly urgent conference as the proceedings continued. The hearing recessed for the day, with the judge scheduling formal trial proceedings for the following month. But Denise's follow-up article the next morning carried a headline that told Emily everything she needed to know about which direction the wind had truly turned. Witness testimony deals major blow to Crane Holdings' defense. 3 weeks later, before the formal trial ever needed to convene, Gordon Crane's lawyers negotiated a plea agreement: restitution to all identified victims, forfeiture of Crane Land Holdings' business license permanently, and a prison sentence of 18 months for fraud and racketeering. That Emily, sitting in the gallery for the final proceeding, found herself watching with a strange, quiet stillness, rather than the triumphant satisfaction she'd expected to feel. Roger Pruitt's case concluded similarly, though his sentence carried an additional charge related to insurance fraud. Specifically, his professional license permanently revoked, his name added to a state registry that would follow him for the rest of his working life. "Doesn't feel like I thought it would," Emily admitted to Hawk afterward, sitting on the courthouse steps in the thin autumn sunlight. "Justice rarely does," Hawk said. "It's not supposed to feel like triumph, Emily. It's supposed to feel like the ground finally holding steady again." Emily considered that, turning it over in her mind, and found she couldn't disagree. "What about the other families?" she asked. "The restitution, will it actually reach them?" "Already started," Hawk said. Alan Pruitt's testimony helped identify 11 additional victims across 3 counties, not just the 4 we already knew about. Restitution funds being processed through the court now. It's not going to fix everything for everybody, but it's a start most of them never thought they'd get. Emily nodded, watching a group of pigeons scatter across the courthouse plaza, feeling something in her chest finally fully unclench after nearly 2 months of carrying this fight like a stone lodged permanently beneath her ribs. "It's over," she said quietly, testing the words, uncertain if she fully believed them yet. "It's over," Hawk confirmed. "Now we get to build the part that actually matters." The grand reopening was Sadie's idea originally, though it grew far beyond anything she'd initially proposed once word spread through the county and somehow well beyond it. What started as a small suggestion, you should throw some kind of celebration when the shop's fully back up and running, give the town a reason to come see what we built, transformed over the following weeks into something considerably larger. Fueled by a community that had watched an entire narrative unfold in real time and wanted desperately to be part of its ending. Emily spent the days leading up to the event in a constant pleasant blur of preparation, coordinating with Mrs. Dawson on food donations that had somehow multiplied into what looked like enough to feed the entire county twice over, working with Deacon on final touches to the community center's shelving and signage, fielding calls from local news outlets who wanted to cover what Denise had started referring to with a journalist's fondness for a good headline as the Willow Creek story. Jake, fully healed now, his limp entirely gone except on the coldest mornings, had taken to visiting most weekends, having apparently appointed himself Emily's unofficial younger brother in the months since the storm. "You nervous?" he asked her the night before the reopening, the two of them sitting on the front steps of the finished shop, the community center glowing warm and welcoming beside it. "A little," Emily admitted. "It's strange having people look at this place and see something worth celebrating instead of just tragedy." "It is something worth celebrating," Jake said. "You know that, right? Not just the shop, all of it. What you did, what it turned into." Emily was quiet for a moment, looking out over the lot, where 3 months earlier, a tornado had reduced everything she'd built to splinters and mud. "I just opened a door," she said softly. "That's all I did, Jake. I just opened a door." Jake shook his head slowly. "That's the thing about doors, though, isn't it? Sometimes opening the right one at the right moment changes everything that comes after. You didn't just save 27 guys that night. You saved this whole town's chance to actually see us. And I think somewhere in there we ended up saving you right back." Emily didn't have an answer for that, but she didn't need one. She simply sat with him in the quiet evening, watching the last light fade behind the rebuilt shop, feeling something settled and whole take root in her chest for the first time in longer than she cared to count. The morning of the reopening arrived bright and clear, the kind of crisp autumn day that made even the flattened, storm-scarred edges of the county look almost gentle in the golden light. By 9 o'clock, the lot was already filling townspeople who'd watched the rebuild unfold from a careful distance, now arriving with genuine enthusiasm. Mrs. Dawson directing volunteers at a long table of donated food with the brisk authority of a woman who had clearly found new purpose in the months since the storm, Sheriff Whitfield arriving not in his cruiser, but on an old restored motorcycle of his own that drew appreciative whistles from several of the riders who'd begun trickling back in for the occasion. By 10, the crowd had grown large enough that Emily found herself briefly overwhelmed, stepping back into the cool shade of the shop's new bay to catch her breath, hands pressed against her chest. "You all right?" Hawk's voice, gentle, found her there a moment later. "Just a lot of people," Emily admitted. "A lot of feelings I wasn't fully prepared for." Hawk studied her for a long moment, something warm and unhurried in his expression. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. None of it. Not today, not any day going forward if you don't want to." Something in the way he said it made Emily's breath catch, made her look up at him, fully searching his face for whatever lay underneath the words. "Hawk," she started, uncertain exactly what she meant to say. "I know," he said quietly before she could find the words herself. "I know this isn't the moment for it with half the county waiting outside. But Emily, I need you to know these last 3 months riding out here every chance I got, making calls, organizing chapters, none of that was just about a debt anymore. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being about what you did for us that night and became about who you are. And I don't know exactly what that means yet or what it's supposed to look like, but I didn't want to keep pretending it wasn't there." Emily felt her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the crowd outside, nothing to do with nerves about the reopening, everything to do with the steady, careful man standing in front of her, who had ridden through a tornado to save his brothers and then ridden back 100 times over to save her. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly. "I have for a while now. I just wasn't sure it was allowed, wasn't sure it made sense considering everything." "There's no rule book for this," Hawk said, a small, warm smile breaking across his face. "Believe me, I checked." Emily laughed, surprised, the sound breaking some of the tension gathered in her chest. And for a brief, suspended moment, standing in the shop that had been rebuilt by 1,680 strangers who had become something closer to family. She allowed herself to simply feel it, the warmth, the possibility, the quiet, steady rightness of a connection that had been building since the night a door opened in the middle of a storm. "We should get out there," she finally said, though she made no move to leave. "We should," Hawk agreed, equally unmoving. It was Jake poking his head into the bay with a grin that suggested he'd caught at least part of the moment who finally broke the spell. "Hey, Lovebirds crowd's asking for Emily. Might want to save the rest of this for later." Emily flushed deep red and Hawk laughed outright, and the two of them finally stepped out into the bright crowded lot together, Emily's hand finding his without either of them quite deciding to make it happen, simply because it felt like exactly where it belonged. The crowd outside had grown considerably larger than Emily had anticipated. Not just Willow Creek's residents, but riders from a dozen different chapters who'd made the trip, some familiar faces from the original 27 others, part of the massive convoy that had rolled down Route 9 months earlier. All of them mingling easily now with townspeople who had, over the course of a single transformative season, learned to see past the leather and the patches to the people who actually wore them. Denise was there with the photographer capturing the scene for what she told Emily would be a final piece, closing out the story that had by that point been picked up by outlets well beyond the state's borders. Mrs. Dawson had somehow recruited half the church choir to provide impromptu music. Somewhere near the community center, Sadie was leading a tour for a family who had lost their own home in the same storm, showing them the shelves stocked with donated supplies. The small children's play area someone had thoughtfully added in a back corner. Hawk climbed onto the shop's front steps as the crowd's attention gradually gathered. Emily standing just beside him, her hand still tucked in his, feeling the weight of dozens, then hundreds of eyes settling onto them, with a warmth that no longer carried any trace of the wariness that had once greeted the club's arrival. "I'm not much for speeches," Hawk began, and a ripple of affectionate laughter moved through the riders who knew him well enough to recognize the understatement. "But I think this moment deserves a few words anyway, so bear with me." He looked out over the crowd, then down at Emily beside him, and something in his expression softened even further. "3 months ago," he said, 27 of us rode into a tornado we had no business surviving. We were scared, we were hurt, and we found a stranger standing in the middle of that storm who had every reason in the world to lock her door and let us figure out our own fate. Instead, she opened it. He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "Most people, when they see men who look like us coming down the highway, they see trouble," Hawk continued. "They see exactly what years of headlines and warnings have taught them to see." Emily Carter looked at 27 strangers in the middle of the worst storm this county's seen in a generation, and she saw 27 human beings who needed help. That's it. That's the whole difference. And because of that one decision made in about 10 seconds flat in the middle of hurricane winds, every single one of those 27 men is alive today. A murmur of agreement rolled through the riders, several of them nodding, one or two visibly emotional. "When this woman needed us," Hawk said, his voice growing stronger, "when men who thought her tragedy was a business opportunity tried to take everything she had left, we didn't have to think twice about what came next. 1,680 of us rode here because a debt like that doesn't get repaid with a handshake and a thank you. It gets repaid by showing up, by standing beside somebody until the fight's actually over." He turned fully to face Emily now, his voice dropping slightly, though it still carried clearly across the silent listening crowd. "Most people saw 27 bikers and saw trouble," he said. "You saw 27 human beings who needed help. That's why 1,680 people came when you needed us." Emily felt tears rising, unable to stop them, unwilling even to try. "This town," Hawk continued, turning back toward the crowd, "spent a long time being afraid of people like us. And maybe some of that fear was earned somewhere along the way by somebody at some point. I won't pretend our world's perfect, because it isn't. But what happened here these last 3 months, that's not the exception. That's who most of us actually are underneath the leather and the patches everybody's so quick to judge. We protect people. We show up. And we don't forget kindness, ever, no matter how long it takes us to properly repay it." He gestured toward the new sign frame above the shop's entrance, still covered by a simple cloth Sadie had rigged that morning for exactly this moment. "Emily," Hawk said, turning to her, "you've been putting off deciding what this place should be called. I think it's time." Emily looked up at the covered sign, her heart pounding, 3 months of grief and terror and unexpected grace, crystallizing suddenly into absolute clarity. Pull it down, she said. Deacon, standing near the sign with a rope in hand, gave it a firm tug, and the cloth fell away to reveal fresh lettering, carefully painted by Sadie's own hand, over the past week in secret the open-door garage. The crowd erupted into applause whistles, cutting through the warm autumn air, and Emily stood beneath the new sign with tears streaming freely down her face, feeling 3 generations of Carter history honored not by staying frozen in place, but by growing into something even larger than what had come before. It represents the moment, Emily said once the applause finally settled enough for her voice to carry, when I chose compassion over fear. When men this whole world taught me to be afraid of turned out to be exactly the people I needed most. I lost everything my family built in that storm. But what came after, what all of you built here together, that's not a replacement. It's proof that sometimes the worst night of your life can also be the beginning of the best chapter. She looked out at the crowd, Mrs. Dawson dabbing at her eyes, Sheriff Whitfield nodding solemnly, Jake grinning ear to ear, Sadie and Deacon standing shoulder to shoulder with pride, hundreds of riders and townspeople who had, over the course of one impossible season, dismantled every assumption that had once kept them separate. Sometimes, Emily said, her voice growing steadier with each word, the people society fears the most are the ones who remember kindness the longest. I found that out the hard way, but I wouldn't trade what I learned for anything, not even to have my old life back exactly as it was. Hawk stepped forward, then taking both her hands in his in front of the entire gathered crowd, and Emily understood without needing a single additional word exactly what he intended to ask her, though he waited, giving her the choice the same way he'd always given her the choice every single step of this journey. Emily Carter, he said loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, I know this isn't exactly traditional standing here in front of half the county and every chapter brother who made the trip, but I've never been much for doing things the traditional way, and neither have you. I'm not asking for anything today except permission to keep showing up every day for as long as you'll have me. Emily laughed through her tears, squeezing his hands tightly. You've been showing up for 3 months straight. I think that answer's pretty clear. I want to hear you say it anyway, Hawk said, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Yes, Emily said loud and clear, and absolutely certain. Keep showing up for as long as you want to. The crowd's cheer that followed rattled windows clear across the lot riders, whooping and revving engines in celebration. Mrs. Dawson openly weeping into a handkerchief, Jake pumping his fist in the air like his own team had just won a championship. The celebration stretched long into the evening, food and music and easy laughter, filling a lot that 3 months earlier had held nothing but wreckage and grief. Emily moved through the crowd in a warm, grateful daze, accepting congratulations, listening to Deacon tell increasingly exaggerated versions of the rebuild to a rapt audience of teenagers, watching Sadie patiently answer a dozen questions from curious kids about what it was like being one of the few women riding with such a large chapter. Near sunset, Emily found a quiet moment away from the crowd, standing at the edge of the lot where the highway curved out of sight, the same stretch of road 27 motorcycles had appeared on in the middle of a storm that had once threatened to take absolutely everything from her. Hawk found her there, as he seemed to always find her, exactly when she needed him most, and settled beside her without a word, simply present, simply steady. Do you ever think about it? Emily asked quietly. That night, what might have happened if I hadn't opened that door? Every single day, Hawk admitted. I think about it every time I look at Jake walking around on a leg that healed clean because you knew exactly what to do in the dark with nothing but a flashlight and steady hands. I think about it every time one of the brothers who was in that shelter calls just to check in, just to say thank you again, like once was never going to be enough. I think about what would have happened to me, Emily said, if you hadn't come back, if nobody had ever answered that scrap of paper you gave me. I keep wondering how much longer I would have lasted fighting Crane and Pruitt completely alone before I just gave up and signed whatever they put in front of me. You wouldn't have given up, Hawk said with quiet certainty. I've known you 3 months, Emily, and if there's one thing I've learned about you, it's that you don't know how to quit. You'd have found another way. Might have taken longer, might have cost you more, but you'd have found it. Emily considered that, watching the last light fade gold and amber across the flattened, healing landscape, stretching out beyond the highway. Maybe, she said, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out. So am I, Hawk said. They stood together in comfortable silence as the celebration continued behind them, music and laughter drifting on the cooling evening air. The community center glowing warm and welcoming beside a shop that had risen stronger from its own ashes. A sign overhead that would greet every person who pulled into that lot from this day forward with a simple, powerful truth that sometimes the door you're most afraid to open is exactly the one that saves you. Weeks later, once the excitement of the reopening had settled into the steady, comfortable rhythm of everyday life, Emily stood behind the counter of the open-door garage on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, ringing up a customer's bill, laughing at something Jake had said, from where he now worked part-time as her apprentice, having decided with Hawk's blessing that the open road could wait a while longer for a young man determined to learn everything Emily Carter had to teach him about engines and second chances alike. Through the front window, she watched the highway stretch out toward the horizon, the same road that had once brought a tornado and then 27 strangers and then eventually 1,680 more. She thought about her husband sometimes still in quiet moments, thought about what Daniel would say if he could see what his family's shop had become, how it had grown into something even larger than either of them had ever imagined it could be. She liked to think he'd understand. She liked to think he'd have opened that same door if their positions had been reversed, because that was simply the kind of man he'd been, and the kind of woman his loss had eventually unexpectedly helped her become. The tornado had taken everything Emily Carter had built, but it had also revealed something she never could have predicted, standing in the wreckage that first terrible morning, that sometimes the worst night of a person's life becomes the doorway into everything good that follows. That courage shown to strangers has a way of finding its way back tenfold, and that the people the world teaches us to fear most are often the very ones who remember kindness the longest and repay it the loudest. And never ever let a debt like that go unanswered. One woman opened a door in the middle of a storm, and in doing so, she proved once and for all that a single act of compassion, however small it might seem in the moment it's given, has the power to change absolutely everything that comes after.